Good morning. I now reconvene the general session. Will the recording secretary please call roll?
Kathleen Alloway, Kirsten Barnes, Catherine Williams Brown, C. Michael Cooney, Linda Darling Hammond, Marisol Escobedo, Jose Gonzalez, Makita Grinnell Shire, Johanna Howig, Alicia Hine, Terry Jackson, Bonnie Clapp, Kevin Kwan, Jane Marks, Monica Martinez, Castle Redmond, Ade Rodriguez, Tina Sloan, Andrew Wall. We have a quorum.
I now open the public hearing. The commission has 3 public hearing items before it today. Item 21 is the proposed amendments to Title V of the California Code of Regulations pertaining to cost recovery fees for extraordinary accreditation activities. Catherine Polster and Cheryl Hickey will review the proposed amendments to the regulations and the response to the solicitation of public comment. Ms. Polster, please begin.
Good morning, Commissioners. Cheryl Hickey is here to answer any accreditation-related questions, but this should be fairly brief. At the September Commission meeting, staff brought forward draft amendments to the cost recovery regulations, and staff was directed to publish a notice with the Office of Administrative Law to begin the rulemaking process. The notice was published on December 7th, which started the 45-day comment period, and that ended on January 21st, and no public comments were received. Should the regulation text remain as it was published on December 7th, and with Commission approval, staff will complete a final regulation packet for submission to the Office of Administrative Law for their 30-day review period. However, if changes are made to the draft amendments today as a result of public comments, a notice must be published for 15 days to allow for public comment on the changes, and staff would return to the Commission at a later date. Overall, the changes proposed to these regulations are necessary to align the cost recovery fee schedule with the current accreditation system. Changes include updated terminology, alignment to the current IPR and IIA processes, removal of the underutilized in-kind option for program review. In the September item, which is located in Appendix A of this item, there are the proposed regulation text in an underline and strike-through format, the current regulations, and the governing statutes proposed for the regulations in the appendices. The body of the item also details each amendment and the necessity for the amendment. So, again, if the Commission approves these regulations today, staff will prepare a final rulemaking packet to be delivered to the Office of Administrative Law with a likely approval date of April 2019. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have at this time.
Thank you. We will now open for public comment. I have no public comment cards, so the public comment period is now closed. Members of the Commission, are there any questions that you have about the proposed regulations that you would like to address to staff? Seeing none, I ask the members of the Commission, what is your intent as to these regulations? Do I have a motion to approve staff recommendation? Moved by Commissioner Klatt. Do we have a second? Commissioner Marks? Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Item 2J is the proposed amendments to Title V of the California Code of Regulations pertaining to administrative services credentials. Tammy Dugan will review the proposed amendments to the regulations and the response to the solicitation of public comment. Ms. Dugan, please begin.
Thank you, and good morning, members of the Commission. The amendments to Section 80054 for California Prepared Administrators update the revision date for the program standards document to the version that includes the Cal APA as adopted at the June 2018 meeting, and all other program standard revisions that have been adopted by the Commission since June of 2014. When a document is incorporated by reference in a regulation, it becomes part of the regulation. It's just not printed. So by having it in the program standards and updating that revision date, once those regulations are approved, the Cal APA will be a requirement for preliminary program completers in California. The proposed amendments to Section 80054 also include general cleanup to the previous language for clarity and consistency purposes. The amendments to Section 80054.1 for out-of-state prepared administrators are to allow those individuals to substitute up to 2 years of administrative experience earned outside of California in lieu of the 5 years of teaching or services experience required for the preliminary credential. That was approved by the Commission in September of 2017, but we were kind of waiting for the Cal APA issue to be resolved so we could just open both sections at the same time and make sure that the regulations, because there are cross-references, are all legit. The Commission received 2 comments related to the proposed amendments before the agenda item was posted that are included in the agenda item beginning on page 21. One additional comment from the California School Boards Association in support of the amendments proposed for out-of-state administrators was received after posting of the agenda, and I believe you have a copy of that letter already. Staff recommends that the Commission approve the proposed amendments to Title V of the California Code of Regulations, Sections 80054 and 80054.1, as presented in Item 2J, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right. We have one public comment card. Dr. Peg Winkleman, would you please come on up and state your name and affiliation for the record?
Good morning. Dr. Peg Winkleman, representing California Professors of Educational Administration. You have our letter with you, so I'm only going to read 2 excerpts to make our point. As we consider Item 2J, proposed amendments to Title V of California regulations pertaining to administrative credentials, we recognize the breadth and depth of work that has occurred since 2014. We acknowledge the logical equivalency of the proposal to allow out-of-state prepared administrators with at least 3 years of full-time teaching or services experience to substitute 2 years of out-of-state administrative experience to satisfy the 5-year teaching services experience requirement for the preliminary administrative services credential. We want to take this opportunity to note that preparation itself is not equivalent, because out-of-state administrators will not be required to pass the Cal APA. Thus, out-of-state administrators will not be held to the same standard. We raised the Cal APA at this time because the consequential year of the Cal APA is set to begin this fall, and many design issues have yet to be resolved. CAPIA members who actively participated in think tanks, virtual office hours, and scoring sessions continue to raise essential questions regarding not just discrepancies in the directions in the scoring rubrics, but the scope of cycles 1 and 2. It is critical that, 1, the cycles model best practice, and 2, that candidates are provided the conditions, i.e. time for preparation, practice, and reflection, to demonstrate their leadership capacity. With this in mind, we again ask that a group be convened to work to resolve the issues that have come to light through the pilot process before proceeding to a high-stakes consequential year. Moreover, we request that the convening group include both members from the original design team as well as new members. On behalf of our membership, I thank you in advance for your consideration of our concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no more public comment cards. Commissioners, do you have comments or questions? This is your chance. Okay. All right. Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve staff recommendation? We have a motion by Commissioner Hartwig, and we have a second. Second by Commissioner Martinez. Second. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, say no. Motion carries. Is it too early for everyone? Like we need a little pick-me-up. All right. Thank you. Next is item 2K, proposed addition to Title V of the California Code of Regulations pertaining to the handling of applications from qualified individuals with disabilities. This item will also be presented by Ms. Dugan. Please begin.
Thank you, and good morning again. 3 public hearings in under 15 minutes. Here we go. Government Code Section 12944 prohibits licensing boards from failing or refusing to make reasonable accommodations to an individual's mental or physical disability or mental condition. However, the Government Code section doesn't specify how applications are to be handled by individuals with disabilities. The purpose of the proposed edition of Title V, Section 80002.1 is to clarify that applications will be processed by the Commission Certification Division. Staff in the Certification Division will determine whether an individual has submitted sufficient medical documentation to verify the disability and whether the requested accommodation is reasonable. The Commissioner received 2 comments in support and 2 comments in opposition to the originally proposed language. The comments, along with staff's responses, begin on page 3 of the agenda item. The comments in opposition supported the addition of Section 80002.1, but the respondents felt additional language is needed for clarity purposes. Staff agrees that additional language would help clarify the proposed addition. Therefore, the originally proposed language has been modified as shown beginning on page 7 of the agenda item, with the additional language in double underline. If the additional language or any version other than the original language is adopted by the Commission today, a 15-day notice will be required prior to submission of the rulemaking file to the Office of Administrative Law for final review. Staff recommends that the Commission adopt the proposed addition of Section 80002.1 to Title V of the California Code of Regulations pertaining to the handling of applications from qualified individuals with disabilities as amended in Item 2K, and instruct staff to prepare a 15-day notice. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Excellent. Thank you. We have 1 public comment card. Danette Brown, please come on up and state your name and affiliation for the record.
Good morning, Danette Brown representing the California Teachers Association. We would like to say thank you to the Commission staff and to the Commission. We really appreciate the opportunity to give feedback on this important item, and we especially appreciate the collaborative culture that we have, and we appreciate that you have really listened to that feedback and incorporated that into the revisions. And because of that, I'm coming to speak in favor of the revised language and that we support item 2K. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That is it for public comment. Public comment is now closed. Commissioners, this is your opportunity to ask any questions or make a comment of your own. Okay, seeing none. Do we have a motion to approve staff recommendation? Moved by Commissioner Marks and second by Commissioner Rodriguez. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Any opposed, say no. Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was amazing. 14 minutes. All right, we are now going to recess the general session and move into the Educator Preparation Committee. Mr. Rodriguez. Thank you. Sure.
Good morning. So we have 2 items, and I just want to remind everyone that public comments are limited to 2 minutes, and the timer will go off when your 2 minutes are up. Okay? So we'll start with 4E. Draft Revised Program Standards for Pupil Personnel Services, PPS, Credential Programs, and Draft Revised PPS Candidate Performance Expectations. This item is being presented by Lynette Roby. This is an information item. Ms. Roby, will you please begin?
Yes, thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
I had good afternoon written down here, but I'll change that. I bring before you the Draft Revised Pupil Personnel Services Program Standards and Draft Candidate Performance Expectations for your discussion and comments. Consultant Karen Sacramento, who has been working on the updates to the PPS standards and expectations along with me, would have been here, but she had a family emergency and is not able to attend. But in her stead, I have Administrator Cheryl Hickey, who's going to help answer questions. Sorry. My voice isn't that loud, and I forget to get too closer. Is this better? Updates to the PPS standards were provided to the Commission during the December 2017 meeting and August 2018 meeting. And since that time, the PPS work groups were gathered for one additional meeting where they once again worked tirelessly and passionately on these draft standards and performance expectations. This item includes the additional revisions from that meeting. Following this presentation, staff will be happy to answer any process questions that you have or any overarching questions. If you have any specific questions related to either school counseling, school psychology, or social work, we will have sufficient time to take those back to the work groups for further discussion and consideration. So to begin, the PPS program standards were adopted in October of 2000. A table illustrating the current structure of those standards is provided on page 1 of the item. And you can see that each of the specialty areas has a large number of standards, 32 for school counseling, 27 for school psychology, and 25 for school social work. So throughout the 2017-18 year, the PPS work groups met to update and streamline the current standards and strengthen them. And as a result, the design has been revised and streamlined, and each specialty area is now comprised of 5 standards, along with the performance expectations. This structure of standards and performance expectations now more closely aligns to other recently revised standards, such as the Administrative Services, Preliminary Administrative Services Standards, and the Preliminary Multiple Subject, Single Subject Standards, in which the standards now define what a program must do, and the performance expectations define the knowledge and the skills candidates must have before being recommended for credential. As the work groups drafted the standards and the performance expectations, they kept a focus on current responsibilities and expectations related to issues and concerns in today's schools. And during the time the groups have been meeting, field surveys were conducted to gather stakeholder feedback, and the work groups analyzed that feedback and incorporated it into the draft standards and draft performance expectations. You do have a complete copy of both the standards in Appendix B, and the performance expectations are provided for you in Appendix C. So now I'd like to take a moment to talk a bit about the organization of the draft standards. On page 2 of the item, you will find a chart that illustrates how the 3 separate specialty area draft standards have been organized. They're organized in a parallel structure across all 3 specialty areas. So, for example, as I stated earlier, there are 5 standards in each specialty area. Program Standard 1 in each of the 3 specialty areas addresses program design and rationale. Program Standard 2 requires the programs to teach the candidates about the performance expectations. Program Standard 3 in each of the 3 specialty areas requires the programs to monitor, support, and assess candidate progress towards meeting those performance expectations. Standard 4 defines clinical practice, and Standard 5 requires the programs to ensure that candidates have met the performance expectations prior to recommending an individual for their credential. So now a bit about the organization of the performance expectations. Again, you've been provided that in Appendix C. They're organized by key aspects that beginning practitioners in each specialty area should have the opportunity to learn and practice through coursework and fieldwork. And a few of the key items or key aspects of the performance expectations have been highlighted on pages 4 and 5 of the item. But they include some of the following. First, in an effort to bring greater national cohesion and continuity to the standards while also allowing the inclusion of additional content in those standards for areas of need that are more unique to California, each of the three specialty areas have been aligned with frameworks, guidelines, and principles of their respective national professional organizations. And you'll find the source documents for those national organizations on page 6 of the item if you're interested in looking at those. Another key aspect of the new performance expectations is a deepened and more robust field and training component. Additionally, there's an increased attention to engaging in areas of social justice, equity, and diversity, social and emotional well-being, and student mental health concerns. Also, it should be noted that one of the specialty areas, school counseling, added 200 hours of field experience and an additional 100 hours of practica. And they did this to ensure adequate breadth of experiences for candidates and to better align with the national standards. Those are just a few of the key aspects of the performance expectations. But I wanted to note that additionally, the work groups collaborated and developed a set of common principles, values, and goals. And as a result, developed a statement, it's about 3 paragraphs, I believe, which is to become a part of each of the 3 sets of credential standards. And you can find the statement in its entirety on pages 3 and 4 of the item. And in the area of child welfare and attendance, 2 things. First, there is a need throughout the state for child and welfare attendance practitioners, but there are relatively few programs in the state that offer these. So the work groups discussed this at length, and they revised the performance expectations and standards and embedded child welfare and attendance as an option in each of the 3 specialty areas, while ensuring at the same time that the necessary and appropriate components of that authorization were addressed. Before closing, I'd like to acknowledge one thing, and that is that we realize that we have received a letter from the California School Board Association, which you have a copy. The CSBA provided some suggested related to fieldwork language, and we appreciate their comments, and we'll be taking those comments back to the work group. We don't anticipate any issues around these concepts that they've provided. And I'd also just take just a second before I close, and that is just to say thank you to the work groups for all of the hard work that they've been putting into these and the hard work they're still putting in. So for the next steps, based on Commission's directive between now and the April meeting, staff will work with the work groups, again, to make modifications as directed, refine language, and continue to reach out to the field for any final input. Staff then plans to bring forth an item back to the April Commission meeting for consideration and possible adoption of the revised PPS program standards and performance expectations. And at that time, we will also include timelines and a plan for supporting the transition of programs to the new performance expectations and standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Roby. We will now open for public comment. So I don't have any public comment cards. Seeing no public comment, the public comment period for this item is now closed. Do commissioners have any questions or comments on this item? Commissioner Wall?
So I got a whole bunch of feedback about this in advance, so I have a series of questions. I was trying to listen carefully to see if you answered them as you went along, but first, you just mentioned that there would be opportunity for feedback from the field. So the question from the field is actually, how is that going to happen? Will there be a survey? What exactly will be done in terms of additional feedback?
We have had 2 surveys that were sent out to the field. We could certainly talk about another survey, but that is one of the ways that we elicit or solicit feedback. And we also have panel members that represent, not panel members, work group members that send out and get information out to their constituents. And
that's great. I mean, I think that my question is mostly the gist of it is what's the route you'd like to hear feedback? I mean, whether it's to reach out to a panel member or you will be actually sending a survey, just how is that?
Yeah, they're welcome to reach out at any time. Additionally, either way.
Okay.
Yeah, we're open to any feedback, absolutely. And we take that all into consideration.
I think maybe the most direct thing might be to just have them email Lynette or Karen Sacramento, and then we can reach out with and work with the panel members to address any concerns or issues that still remain.
Okay.
We have done 2 surveys, so we had not planned to do a survey between now and April. If there appears to be some concerns, we could certainly do that.
Okay, that's great. Can I keep going? Because I just have like 4 questions. Second is, and actually this is something that was unclear to me as I read through this. The child and welfare, which you mentioned toward the end, will this mean that integration, they simply must do the 150 hours, or does the institution still have to complete the 8 standards that already exist?
No. So the plan is, the work groups really discuss this at length because there is such a need, but so few programs. So it's 150 hours. It's an option within each of the 3 areas. But the 8 standards, those elements within those 8 standards have been really thought out and integrated into the coursework and fieldwork that's required within they're addressed, and then that 150 hours is.
So the 8 it doesn't go away. They do go.
They go away, but they're integrated into.
I get you. Okay. Okay, so that clarifies. That will help me.
Not alone any longer. They'd be integrated into the programs.
Okay, great. A big question is the integration of mental health into the school counseling and school social work performance expectations. So, I think this is a piece of feedback I would offer. The concern about whether mental health is sufficiently addressed, given what we know is happening in schools, and walking that fine line between the role of the school counselor in providing support but not being a licensed counselor, right, depending upon their background, but still providing it. So that's just a piece of feedback that I think is important. And finally, this is my final one. The matrix is great. This shows the alignment between the national standards. And so a question that programs I think will have is, are they going to have to separately show that alignment, or will that be integrated into them addressing these standards?
I'm not sure I understand.
Separately show alignment of the national standards, or simply show alignment to our standards?
Okay. So I think I can answer that question. So we have for many years had a commitment to trying to streamline the processes between those institutions or programs that are nationally accredited and those in California. So what we would do once the commission adopts the standards is do a crosswalk to identify any areas where there is not alignment. That still needs to be done. Even though it should be much, much closer, because that was one of the major efforts of the work group. Then essentially what happens is we would work with the institutions to make sure that any documentation they are able to provide to the national body, as long as it's aligned with our standards, would be used for our processes as well. So we have some work to do in this area, and we'll be using the panel members to bring together to talk about how that would happen. But that's what we try to do. We don't want the institutions to have to do double work if they're addressing the same issue. So that is sort of a next step once there's some adoption here at this level. It's sort of like what we've done with CAPE.
Okay. I think people will be, okay, great. That's very helpful. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Commissioners? Commissioner Barnes.
Well, I think everybody knows how I feel about this item and how it's been a long time coming and very excited about it. I do want to address something that Commissioner Wall brought up about the mental health. You're correct. School counselors are not licensed. We don't want to be licensed. However, in the current frameworks that we have and the things we're being asked to do, I think you're right. It has to be done correctly. But our school counselors are coming out not ready to deal with the things that we're being asked to deal with. We have trauma, students with trauma, suicide prevention, anxiety. We're kind of like the first level triage, so we can figure out where to get them. but there has not been, there's this assumption that the school counselors get this training, but in this current field, unless you have fought for it or you have a district who's behind you. So our candidates coming in, we want them to have the exposure to everything they're going to sadly have to deal with and the things we are responsible for, but then also have the knowledge of how do I outreach, because I'm not the licensed person, but sometimes I'm the first person, and then I got to figure out who to get them to. And so just the types of mental health issues students are having today, helping them in the classroom, helping them just like maybe get through life and figuring out things, because we're there day to day. And depending on where you're at, some districts have a social worker and a psychologist and other people on hand, whereas where I'm at, you kind of have to outreach. So we are on the same page. We are not licensed. We don't want people to think we're licensed. And that's a fine line, but at the same time, we want the candidates coming out so that they can be equipped for at least, it's like, oh, what do I do with this student? I've never heard of this. And that's kind of right now, it's been you're learning as you go, trial by fire. And so the role has changed so much, even when I became a school counselor. So, and that's, so we are aware of that and we're on the same page. And we again want to thank the work group and the staff. It's been a very, in fact, we have another call Monday night with my group, but, because they're very interested in what happens here. But all the groups are very invested in what happens here because we definitely want to have the candidates in all programs coming out ready, better prepared for the schools and the students that we have to service today.
Commissioner Collette.
Yes, thank you. I have a question, and maybe Commissioner Barnes can answer it, or maybe whoever can answer this. I was noticing on page 5 where it has the bullet points where the key aspects of the proposed standards are listed for each of the 3. And in the first one for the social work standards, one of the bullets is a deepened collaborative and robust fieldwork requirement. And I didn't see that same bullet in the other 2. And so I have a question about fieldwork. And Commissioner Barnes, you've brought up the statistics, I think even just yesterday, about the caseload that many counselors in our high schools have, or in K-12, but I'm thinking specifically high school. And I'm wondering if there are opportunities for school counselors to get that field work in places where counselors, because I'm thinking where the ratios are huge. Unfortunately, I think some counselors end up doing more registrar types of activities than counseling activities. And so I'm wondering if there is a challenge, or if we're finding problems in having candidates actually get field work in the areas that they're being trained and expected to be trained in doing. I'm not sure if anyone can address that, and if why it maybe isn't addressed in the other 2 areas, the field work.
Unless you would like to say something, and we can also take the
So the robust part about the school counseling increase, is that what you're saying?
It's called out in the bullet points for the social work strand, but it's not called out in the bullets for the counselor or school psychologist strand. And it just made me start thinking and having more questions about the field work in general, I guess.
I can answer something about the bullet points. Those were mainly just put together as highlights in each of the separate ones. It doesn't mean that they're not included within those other areas.
And as far as like field work, I mean, it's geography, where you're going through your program, and where you're able to get your experiences. And so, and then of course, that was part of the reason for the recommendation of increasing of the hours, because of all the added things that school counselors are responsible for, that you're not going to get that. You're not going to get that robust experience. I mean, granted, it's adding hours, but we feel that, it's important because you're not going to get that. And, you are responsible for every part of the student, not just this part of the student. So, while we know some people have brought up, oh, that's going to be a challenge, well, it's going to be more of a challenge if you haven't had if you've just got a flyby course and a 5-minute presentation on how to deal with the student anxiety versus actually getting to, be a part of something more real life. So,
Go ahead, Commissioner Collette.
And I think my concern, and maybe this isn't, it's a broader concern perhaps, is because we can't control how districts employ their counselors or how they staff them, the ratios. And so I think that, like, my bigger concern is in what ways what can we do to try to encourage or send that message that counselors, what they do is really important and they can't do their jobs if their caseloads are so high. So I guess that's where my statement was coming from. So I completely agree with what you just said.
Oh, I agree 100%, because there's some districts, they're on the admin, and they have admin duties, and they're dealing just with attendance and things like that, which isn't what a school counselor is there for. I think it also depends on your staffing, where you're at, how many you have. It also comes down to the philosophy of your school board, your superintendent. It's interesting when you talk to people, what does a school counselor do? Well, a teacher, they know what a teacher does, they know what an administrator does. And I think because the role has evolved so much over the years, when I went through high school, you made my schedule, you made me a transcript. I mean, you didn't go to your counselor to talk about stuff. So that's why with this revision, I think that'll start changing the mindset. And sadly, I know I said this before, there's always been a need, but sadly it wasn't until we started having all these shootings and students having all these issues that it's like, oh my gosh, we need school counselors. Well, we always needed them, but there wasn't the proper training either. So so now I'm also excited because once this goes through, then current school counselors can go back to their districts and say, hey, these candidates are going to come out with this, and we're here. So and districts are doing better. I mean, they're seeing that there's this need, but it could get better. And we're thinking this is going to help with that because our role has changed tremendously, and all we want to do is be able to service the students the best we can. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to respond that, of course, there's a responsibility, too, of the accreditation system to make sure that the appropriate field experiences are taking place and making sure that the programs are monitoring that as the candidates are going through their program. So there is that. So as long as the language and the standards is strong enough to make sure that we have something to kind of hang the hat on, if we're finding it, that would be important. So we can certainly bring that back to the group and make sure that they look at it one more time and are comfortable with that kind of language.
Commissioner Brown?
I think it's really clear here in this discussion from hearing my fellow commissioners and also our presenters that the whole field of mental health we're becoming more aware of it. It will be, if we can do exactly what Cheryl says with this, and it would be great to come back and take a look at it, we will support school counseling getting the preparation they need and getting the support they need to meet the appropriate mental health issues that they're seeing for children from TK and their families, TK to 12. But I think this whole piece about mental health, which you brought up, you're talking about, I'd like to see as well. It would be great to take a look at that. And I think working further, we'll see then that some of the field experience that people get will be both inside schools and perhaps in other agencies, such as county behavioral mental health, those kinds of things in their preparation. Yeah, thanks.
Ms. Roby, did you want to say something? Commissioner Barnes?
And also, there's also a big emphasis, too, in updating the college and career readiness portion of it, because that's also kind of been just kind of so there's a whole revamp, and, I've had some questions about, oh my gosh, you guys got so detailed. Well, yeah, we had to, because there was so much missing, and we didn't want it to be too broad, because we wanted programs to have to, we need to make sure that counselors are exposed to all of these things, college, career readiness, social, emotional, all the things that are listed. So it's like I said, a school counselor is responsible for all components of a student. So we want to make sure all those are addressed.
Ms. Roby?
I just wanted to say that was the difficulty in the task, is just all of the many components that the work groups had to consider, and yet how to get those all in and not completely overwhelm the process. So that was a difficult task, but we will certainly, the mental health issue, take it back and for further discussion.
Commissioners, any other questions or comments? So this is an information item.
No further action is needed at this time. Thank you, Ms. Roby. Ms. Hickey?
Thank you for the comments and questions.
Okay. Moving on to item 4F, update on the Commission's program surveys and their use in accreditation. This is the item that I foreshadowed. This item is being presented by Cheryl Hickey and Mike Taylor. This is an information item. Mr. Taylor, will you please begin?
Sure. Good morning. We were here a year ago to talk with you about surveys, and so we're back with an update and a little bit more information this time. As a reminder, the Commission has 9 surveys that we're going to talk about today. We have a preliminary surveys for multiple subject, single subject, and ed specialist. We have a clear induction survey that's for multiple subject, single subject, and ed specialist. We have clear administratives. We have a preliminary administrative services survey. A master teacher survey, an employer survey, and a new survey we're calling a general education survey, which attempts to survey completers of all permits that are not listed in the other surveys. So some of those were combined and updated this year. If you looked at this list compared to last year, you would have seen similar numbers but slightly different. For example, the clear surveys were combined into a single survey where they were separate surveys last year. These surveys were originally, the first of them were originally implemented back in 2015, and over the years we've been updating and adding additional surveys as outlined on page 2, right up to 2018 when we launched the newest survey, which is the General Educator Survey I just mentioned. We do collaborate with the California State University on this process. Everybody knows that the CTQ has a whole bunch of surveys that have been very popular in the state for a long time, and so to keep from try to protect candidates a little bit from survey overload, we have been able for the preliminary surveys to combine our surveys with the CSU surveys, and essentially they embed our questions in the surveys they're already administering. So we get that feedback and the candidates are still answering the same number of surveys. In 2016, we implemented the Master Teacher Survey, and the Master Teacher Survey and the Employer Survey operate a little bit differently from the other surveys in that we don't have people coming to us to obtain a credential that we can link to a survey. So for the Master Teacher Survey, we really rely on programs to send out a link to all their master teachers, and historically relied on them to also tell us the number of master teachers they have so that we can calculate a response rate. And this year we're changing that a little bit because now with the ADS, the Accreditation Data System, we're collecting numbers of master teachers there. The Employer Survey, also in an effort to not confuse everybody with the CSU Employer Survey, is administered in the fall, and it's on a little bit of a limited time frame. And rather than focusing on individual responses about individual teachers that they've hired, it asks the employers to focus more on the program overall. So to that end, we ask them to only respond for programs in which they've hired more than one teacher over the last couple of years. There were a number of changes made to the surveys this year. We made some edits to some of the specific questions in the preliminary surveys, and some additional answer options and questions were added for gender and sexual orientation as required by legislation outlined in the item. Table 1 shows on page 4 the number of completers and response rates that we've been getting overall statewide for these surveys. And the last column in Table 1 shows the number of program response rates, so for the range of them from low to high depending on which program we're talking about. The Master Teacher Survey response rates in Table 2 are somewhat lower, and that's because of the way it's administered. We don't get as many responses as that as we'd like, and we're a little bit spoiled by the high response rates on our other surveys. So these are always, we're always looking for ways to improve this, and we've got some ideas for the future to that end. The statewide reports for all of these surveys can be found, along with the surveys themselves, on the Completer Surveys website, and most of the surveys are linked in the item, and the overall website is linked in the item as well. We do produce program reports for these surveys too, for programs who have enough respondents, and typically we've used a rule of 10. So if they have more than 10 respondents to the survey, they get a detailed report for their program about how their candidates felt about their experience. And to maximize the number of those reports going out, we've sort of implemented some additions to those rules. We have a number of small programs in the state, as you know, and so a lot of people don't get 10 responses. And so we have implemented a rule where if they have more than 5, less than 10, but 100% of their candidates. So if they have 8 candidates and all 8 respond, then we'll give them a program report. And now that we've been doing this a few years, we're also working on some ideas now for producing perhaps a multi-year report for programs that have low numbers of candidates, so that even if they don't get a program level detailed report in any given year, over a number of years, those responses could be compiled to produce that information for the programs. And programs are always able to request their raw data in any case. That's what the surveys are, and I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl Hickey to talk a little bit about how they're used in accreditation.
Okay, so in the agenda item beginning on page 5 is where we outline sort of what we're doing in accreditation, and where we hope to go, or where we're working to build the infrastructure to be able to use really the treasure trove of information that we have at our disposal now. So first and foremost, we wanted to make sure to remind you that, there's an expectation within the accreditation system that the institutions are using survey data along with all the other sources of data that they have as part of their continuous improvement system. So the Commission has long required within their common standards that institutions use data to inform program improvement and its decision making. Since 2007, the previous version of the common standards had a requirement that institutions have a unit and program assessment system where the institution collects, analyzes, and uses the data to drive program improvement. And the current set of common standards that you all adopted in 2015 really went even further than that and made sure that that system includes multiple sources of data, including the extent to which candidates are prepared to enter professional practice, and 2, feedback from key stakeholders such as employers and community partners about the quality of preparation. So it's very clear in the common standards that there's an expectation. We, through the accreditation process, ensure that that is actually happening. So in years 5, under the streamlined accreditation system, we list on page 7 some of the things that we ask an institution to provide us to review. That helps us make sure that an institution has a system established. And so we look at it, and we're very explicit about making sure that that includes program completer surveys and other surveys as well. That tells us that there is something in place, but it doesn't tell us how well that system is being implemented at the institutions. And that's where we get the information really at the site visit, because we really need to talk to individuals about that. So the Board of Institutional Reviewers, who are the reviewers, have access to all of the Commission's program completer surveys and surveys for the institution for which they are assigned. They are expected to include in all the interviews, or the appropriate interviews, the constituencies, a line of questioning to examine, one, to better understand how the institution is using the data at its disposal, but also to drill down on some of those areas where the data may suggest that there may be a potential problem or issue. So last year was really the first year, as Mike said, where the program completer survey was really robust and we could use it. So we really went about making sure that our teams had the access and were making sure that they were using it, that they weren't forgetting that it was there and they needed to, look at the data and ask some questions about it. I think they did a really great job doing that. To ensure that the reviewers are well prepared, we redesigned the BIR, the Board of Institutional Reviewer training last year, and we included some dedicated time to looking at the survey information and talking about what kinds of questions would you ask, what does this kind of maybe suggest, and really getting them thinking about how to use that data and who they would ask what kinds of questions. So we plan on expanding on that this year when we have our next set of BIR trainings starting this summer. And although the teams used the survey data, it was somewhat invisible in our site visit reports this past year. So we really wanted to make another effort this year to say, hey, we really want to see some of that information in the site visit reports. What did the data tell you, and what did you find out about it? So we have an example from an induction in the agenda item, but we are really starting to collect and look at, hey, this is a great example of how teams are using the data. So that takes care of the institutions that are actually going through a site visit, but as you recall, there's many, many other institutions that are not going through a site visit in a given year. So the current work right now is focused on how we as staff can most effectively and efficiently use the vast amount of data that is available and contained within the survey results, how we can analyze the data, and how we can begin to target some of those areas where we find possible issues. So we're building sort of the staff team and building the expertise. We have a staff member who is really getting a lot of training on data visualizations and building dashboards to help us maybe build some internal dashboards that would help flag some issues for us. So, because it really is labor intensive to try to go through each of the many surveys from each institution to kind of figure out where the issues are. So we're doing that work right now, and hopefully by the end of this spring, early summer, we'll have some really good dashboards, internal dashboards that we'll be using to kind of highlight some things. On page 10 and 11, we've talked about some of the ways in which we're thinking about looking at the data, or we are using the data. So as we build these internal dashboards, one of the first things that we think of is that there are probably institutions for which the data looks fairly good across the board. There are no real red flags. Nothing's really popping out as being an issue where the institution is not meeting standards or candidates are dissatisfied or not feeling prepared. For those, it would be nice if we're able to really highlight those and say, okay, the next thing we need to do is really just make sure that the teams have the information and there's really no further action that needs to be done. Number 2 on page, I think it's 10. Sorry, I got to catch up here. Number 2 on 10 talks about, where there are questions on the surveys that are closely tied to standard language. We can really identify some issues and possible ways that, or possible issues that there may be institutions out of alignment with the standards. And those are things that are very specific, like the 600 hours of field work. We know that there's institutions that may pop up on here if we see that candidates are saying, no, I didn't get any field work, or I got only 100 hours of field work. Then we want to identify those. And when we were able to, for the very short period of time that we had the preliminary multiple single subjects surveys up before we had a little glitch and we're redoing it now, we were able to see that there was about 450 program completers who said they had less than 300 hours. Now that may be that they're interpreting the wording of the question differently, or that they don't quite know what their field experience, really what that part is, but it also could indicate an issue. So, that's an area for us to do some further examination. So the other issues, though, are like number 3, what does the distribution of more negative results look like, and how does that distribution change the follow-up that's needed? So on A through D on page 10, we've kind of talked about some variations, and I'd like to use the 2018 Preliminary Administrative Services Program Completer Surveys results as an example of some of these. So each survey has an overarching couple of questions, and in the 2018 Preliminary Administrative Services, the results look very, very positive. So to the question of overall, how well do you think your program prepares graduates to become school leaders, 82.1% of respondents said very well, and another 17.7% said adequately, for an overwhelming 99.8% positive result. And then to the question is, how effective was your preparation program at helping you, so it gets a little bit more specific to the individual, develop the skills and tools you need to become a school leader? 96.9% responded effective or very effective. So very positive, overarching, overall big picture, positive looking things. As you look down, and Mike and the team of those who did the completer surveys and developed them did a good job of really aligning the surveys with the standards and the performance expectations, so we can kind of drill down there. There's buckets, and they follow the standard buckets. So for administrative services, the first 4 buckets: visionary leadership, instructional leadership, school improvement leaderships, and professional learning and growth leaderships. The results are very positive, with a fraction of a percentage suggesting that there's some insufficiency or some candidates who might be feeling less than fully prepared. But as you move to organizational and system leadership, 2 of the 3 questions have strong positive responses. However, in a third, which is about whether the program prepared candidates to develop, implement, and monitor the school budget, we begin to see that there's about 5.6% of respondents who said that they were either not at all prepared or prepared poorly. Now, 5.6 is not a huge number. It's not a frightening number, but there is some room for improvement clearly there. When we delve deeper and look at that raw data for that, 5.6%, we can see that for this question, about a third of the negative responses comes from 4 institutions. Now, those 4 institutions may be the larger institutions. We have not done the further examination yet. They may be the larger ones, so the proportionality might be, not that different and not stand out, but they could also be smaller ones where all the candidates are saying that they're not prepared. So that's the kind of analysis we want to do and be able to go in, and then at that point we may be able to do some one-on-one technical assistance, talking with the institutions, putting our consultants who are, know the admin standards really well. So as you go down, and for the next question, or for one of the questions, for the question, were your field experiences sufficient? This is where it's really interesting. Only 38.6% of all respondents answered in the positive. Now, that doesn't necessarily suggest that the institutions are not meeting standards, but it does say that there's some feedback from the candidates that the institutions might want to know about. And in some case like that, where it's a widely distributed response, that may be something where we want to work with the professional community in that area, with CAPIA and the programs in general about this is how some completers are feeling. So those 2 examples kind of are 2 different ways that we would have to approach things depending on how the data looks. And that is somewhat labor intensive. So where are we right now? So the challenge is basically we've built these wonderful tools that give us a lot of that have a lot of potential for gleaning useful information. And the biggest challenge is finding some efficiencies in how to hone through the data and figure out what to do once we have this data. So what's our plan? We're developing our staff team that will meet regularly and systematically review the results, and identifying some appropriate actions that could be taken, working with the COA, and developing those technological tools. And that's happening right now. So hopefully in the next few months we'll be able to have some good tools. We're going to document what we're doing, so we'll make sure that the COA, the Committee on Accreditation, is involved, that they get a report. There may be some issues we have to bring to them directly because the data indicates that there's multiple problems at an institutions or potential issues. And then, of course, there'll be information in your annual reports each year from the Committee on Accreditation as to how some of this data was used. So it's a work in progress, but we're excited at the possibilities. We're really thankful that, the surveys are giving us some really good data that can be used now. And as soon as we have additional data, such as the TPA data and other outcomes data, we can begin to triangulate a lot of that data. So it gives us even richer data. So happy to answer any questions. We welcome your feedback.
We will now open up for public comment. And I do have a one public comment card. Rigel Massaro.
Good morning, Commissioners. Rigel Massaro with Public Advocates. I really appreciate this item. Surveys have come such a long way. There are really high response rates to support really robust continuous improvement efforts, both on the accreditation side as well for institutions who I know and LEAs who are really using this information. One concerning piece I saw that I understand is complicated. When I went into the looking at access to induction, particularly for teachers in their first year, I know when we revamped those standards and preconditions a few years ago, it was a real priority that new teachers get that support as immediately as possible. And so we saw that I noticed that for the education specialist folks, just about 40% of them reported not being enrolled in an induction or clear credential program for 1 year or more after beginning their assignment. I mean, that's the time we lose a teacher potentially, or really kind of color their experience in teaching. And there's still another 10% that's between 3 and over 5 months. So you have about 50% of teachers not getting that support within their first 3 months of teaching. And those are our special education teachers, where we have the most critical shortage and, frankly, the really hardest job in teaching. That is greater than the averages for multiple subject and single subject, where it was more like 25% reporting. But still, that's quite a high number for more than a year. So I understand that folks are responding to these questions maybe quite a bit of time after they've been enrolled. Maybe the question is confusing. I guess I'm just curious if there is a way to get some clarity and understand better those statistics, because when you pull them up sort of at the statewide level, that was pretty concerning for me. And just want to say we really appreciate that comment staff's attention to budget issues, because budgeting aligned to program effectiveness is really key to closing opportunity gaps for students. Thank you.
Thank you. Would any of you like to respond?
I think she does hit on, there are some issues that are precondition issues also, and things that need immediate attention. So that's a great example of things, excuse me, where within the questions, there may be ones that are much higher priority than other questions, where we really put, these are the ones that we absolutely have to know right away if there's a problem. And so that's part of this work as we kind of prioritize how we analyze the data and what we do with it next.
Great. Commissioners, public comment time is closed. And so, Commissioner Hartwig.
Thanks. Thank you for your work on this. This is very impressive. It seems like there's been really a robust system that is being developed and used. I just have a couple of questions for my own interest. It's great that it sounds like you're doing some really good training for the review teams in terms of how to use the data and interpret it and so on. I know it can be complicated to interpret and then apply survey data. Is there any training that's being offered to the institutions themselves about how they should be interpreting the data that they're being given, or do you expect that at those institutions of higher education they have people already on staff who know how to effectively use survey data?
We are not doing any training. I think for the most part, institutions of higher ed have experts and are able to kind of talk through with faculty, why would this be so, what are we doing? In smaller programs, it's a lot harder because one person's doing everything, or maybe at an LEA, it might be more challenging to do that. But in all cases, I think it's about opening up the dialogue and beginning to ask their own institutional representatives and people who are involved in the program why something might be happening. Why are these numbers looking like this? Did we change something? Did we, those kinds of things. So we don't offer any training for the institutions at this point in time.
I also was interested in whether there are other states that are at a similar stage in terms of really developing robust survey systems that are similar, and if so, do we have plans in the future to compare our results to their results? Any sort of cross research like that?
Sure. When these surveys were developed, the committee, these came out of the redesigning and redeveloping the accreditation system that we worked on for several years, and we had a whole committee working on these, and the committee that worked on them did do some investigation into surveys that other states have been using, and so that was looked at right up front in developing the surveys. But in terms of using the surveys at this point, we haven't done any specific research into what other states are doing and how they're using the data for that comparison. We've been pretty excited about getting these up and running and collecting the information here. So, but that's a great idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was expecting that. Not necessarily happening now, but if we're developing such a great system, it could be very informative for us in the future to see how our results compare to the results in other states, understanding that different states have different systems in terms of their accreditation. And then just one final question, and Ms. Massaro speaking actually answered my question a little bit about this, but I was interested in who else we think might be interested in these survey results besides the institutions and ourselves, and is there a way that we plan on really publicizing them to other stakeholders like public advocates who might be really interested in the results?
That is a good question, and I don't know that we have a solid answer for you, except that we do make the information public as much as possible, in that the statewide reports are all public, and you can get the detailed information on each question and the means and standard deviations and all of that. And the individual program response rates have been made public. The program reports have not been public. So that's a different issue that we haven't looked at yet.
Commissioner Ball?
So first of all, I just want to say how appreciative I am of your framing of this, both in the written articulation and then today you frame this as an opportunity for improvement, and I hope the institutions hear that. I think of Lee Schulman's work on high yield and high stakes assessment, right? And that when we have things that are high stakes, sometimes the yield diminishes. But kept in the framework that you're talking about, which is helping institutions to improve, I think that this is far less intimidating to institutions to really use that information and to make that the primary underlying desire is that constant improvement cycle. So I just say how appreciative I am, both in your written documentation and then as you articulate today, that focus.
Chair Darling Hammond?
Put my microphone on. It's been a long time coming, and it's great to see the results coming out. I have lots of questions. One is about the response rates. There are, on several of the initial graduate surveys, a min of 50% response rates for some institutions. Have you taken a look at whether those are the same institutions that are, having that challenge and what are we doing about that?
We're sort of in the middle right now of finishing reports for this year, and so we haven't looked that closely.
Reports to the institutions, you mean?
Right. Yeah. And we're still working on finishing reports for the preliminary surveys right now is specifically what's happening. And so we haven't looked at that level of detail, but yeah, that's absolutely something we would look at in both cases, both in terms of the accreditation staff and just in terms of, just me looking at the survey results, I would notice that. And I suspect, just off the top of my head, that those low numbers, those 50%, are also programs with very low ends in terms of numbers of candidates. So if they have, again, say 8 candidates and only 4 respond, that could result in something like that. But we haven't looked specifically to see who those are yet.
And would we then be encouraging the universities, the institutions to encourage their candidates to
we've been working on that, but that's in a lot of ways sort of a self-perpetuating process because they really want these reports to be as accurate as possible. We've heard from the institutions that they're interested in the program level reports that they get, and so they've been encouraging their own candidates to respond as well.
So we certainly could, it would be very easy to just notify the institution that, hey, there's an issue here, that if you could possibly do everything you can to encourage your candidates to respond.
And you mentioned that you want to begin to look at whether within institution reports there are some institutions that, may account for a lot of the challenging responses. Do you have a process and staffing to do that? It sounded like that was a challenge, but an important thing to do.
I think that's what we're trying to do right now. We're trying to figure out how to do that efficiently. At some point in time, Mike keeps reminding me, at some point in time you need eyes on the survey. So we do need physical people actually going through the data.
When it goes off to the institution, you've now got it in a
Yes.
institutional form so you can see that.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. That is our intent for sure.
And it's a staffing question at this point?
Yes.
It's helpful to know. Some people will make, I've had this comment made many times when I mention the fact that we've got these surveys, which I think is a terrific thing for people exiting. Then we have the Clear Credential survey 2 years later. Many people will say, well, folks who are leaving their teacher ed program may feel well prepared until they get into the classroom, and then they might discover it's harder than they thought. So it would be really nice if we could add a question or two to the Clear Credential survey that asks people to reflect on how well prepared they were now that they've actually been in the classroom. And I wonder if we might, kind of consider that, because it will give us just another way of giving programs feedback about where people, we might not do all the same, intensive set of questions, but just, a few that would give some feedback on that. So these programs that Rigel Massaro pointed out on the induction programs, there are quite a number of places where people are not getting assigned a mentor relatively quickly. So that's really important for accreditation of those programs. Same question, do we have a means in place? I would assume that at minimum, when you're coming up for accreditation, that's going to be looked at.
Absolutely. That's what the team should certainly be picking up on it. We want to make sure that our own staff is aware of wherever there may be issues that are potential issues, and that they're making sure that the teams are investigating and figuring out what might be accounting for that, if it's anything, and what the institution is doing about it. Hopefully they have also looked at the data and say, oh boy.
And that would be one where, we really want to have enough staffing that eyes are on that right away, and that happens right away. Yeah. I think I have asked I was thinking of the same question that Commissioner Hartwig asked about who else might see the data. Would it ever go onto the dashboard, or how would candidates, know the, kinds of responses from their programs? How are you thinking about that in the short and long run?
Well, as Cheryl said, we've been working on some ideas for flags for staff to review, and maybe even automated flags of reports as they're being produced. But as far as dashboards and other audiences, there has been some talk, and we've definitely been looking at and we're experimenting with internal dashboards to be able to look at this data and visualize it for staff. But it's tough to know what to produce externally, because these surveys, the thing about them is that we promise all the candidates anonymity, and that's already become somewhat of a frustration in some cases in the program level reports. But so it becomes these are all things that we definitely want to think about and want to do. We want to make this information as useful as possible, but it does get tough to be able to put a lot of information out publicly in a lot of different ways. Like in a dashboard, we have to put a lot of thought into it about how to keep protecting that anonymity.
And there is this, I appreciated Commissioner Wall's point that if it's a continuous improvement, you're trying to, maintain some discretion and some, continuous improvement framework on it. At the same time, candidates have some interest in knowing, how well prepared people feel from a program. So I think it's something we should continue to think and talk about. It's an important policy decision for us. It might be that, there's many, many questions. Maybe just the one that says overall, how well prepared did you feel would be, the one that's most appropriate for more public consumption, but I think we should keep this question on the table and try to work our way through that issue. Yeah, and bravo, thank you for getting us to this point. It's very exciting.
Commissioner Brown?
This is great. This is really great. Thank you. I did a little bit of a drill down in the master teacher piece, and it was a short thing. When I clicked on the master teacher survey, it says it's an employer survey. And so I just wanted to say that the titling says employer, but it was clearly for the master teachers. This is another place where we can get really good data. Who are these people? And they're the ones that are taking in the student teachers. The reason that I was interested in that is I think it's really helpful to have that data, and I'm really glad that that's part of it. As someone who I work with the California Early Childhood mentor teachers who are supervising student teachers. And in my region, we meet monthly, so we talk about how to work with student teachers. This is a really rich. I'm really glad they're included. But I remember you saying this has lower numbers. So I'll just go back to what you brought up before, is how might we improve that and then use that to inform how our program is doing. We want to talk to the student teachers when they first start and then when they clear, but we also want to talk to the people who get them and what's going on in that experience. So.
Yeah, with the Master Teacher Survey, one thing that we really think is going to help improve results is now that we're collecting some of that information that we used to have to just literally go out and ask for in our accreditation data system. And so that's going to be a big piece that we think will help them. But in a lot of cases, I think just programs knowing about the survey really helps the most. Again, programs want this information, and so the degree to which they understand that they're getting reports for their program based on this so they can use for improvement, and or just understanding that the commission staff is looking at it, and we may flag something, and the degree to which that information is being used in the accreditation process, and perhaps it could save them some time on an accreditation visit. And Terry's got some more ideas.
We actually weren't as thoughtful in our implementation of the Master Teacher Survey initially. We only opened it for about 6 weeks near the end of the school year. And then in talking with institutions, we realized there are candidates in their final student teaching at all sorts of times. So now the Master Teacher Survey is open, like all the other surveys, from September 1st through August 31st. So it's open all year long. And as Mike shared, we're going to collect the data on how many master teachers worked with your candidates in their final student teaching in our new accreditation data system. So institutions won't have to do a separate survey to give us that data. We had some trouble getting the numbers of the total. And we're going to be making a much more concerted effort to get those institutions to definitely get this out to your master teachers, because the institution is the only entity who knows who those people are. But now that it's open 12 months a year, they can send that out anytime. We'll do the reminding. I really do hope that we'll see a really concerted increase this next year.
Commissioner Klatt?
Well, we're on the topic of the Master Teacher Survey, and I don't know if we, how often we change those questions or add to them, but if someday in the future they're revised, there's a question about, was there adequate time that the candidate was in the classroom that you could observe? I would be really interested to see if there was adequate time to talk with that teacher to reflect and discuss the time they were in the classroom, because in my experience, that's been the missing link. Is they're there and they're gone, and it's really difficult to schedule that time within your teacher's schedule to talk with them.
Commissioner Hind?
I have a clarifying question, and then I have a real question. So my clarifying question is, on the table 2 where it says Master Teacher Survey statewide responses, it shows 740 or so responses. But then if you click on the link to the survey results for Master Teacher, it shows that there were 1,800. Are those different surveys or different, or is it different years, or I don't know. This is the first time I've become aware of that, so okay. I'm looking at it now, and I'll see what I can figure out and let you know. Well, while you're looking, my real question is, what are any ideas that you've had to increase the number of master survey responses? Have you guys? It's always hard. I don't know what the answer is. So I was curious if you had any, to get more master teachers to respond.
It's really this working with our institutions, because they're the ones who send the link to the master teacher. So when we make it more overt to them that as your candidate is completing their student teaching, send this to your master teacher, we will be much more overt. I will be working with Commissioners Wall, Sloan, and Grinnell Shire to make sure that the institutions understand this. We will be giving them reminders. And like I said earlier, instead of only having the survey open about 6 weeks, having it open for 12 months, I do really think that will help. Please, Commissioner Wall, you'll help us?
I just sent an email about it.
Commissioners, any other comments? Questions?
I was just going to say,
Commissioner-
I don't know the answer to that specific question, but I'm going to find out and let you know.
Yeah.
Commissioner Brown?
And just a PS, as the early childhood field gets into public education, that mentor program will be helpful for that as well. So I'll be the little sister for now, but I'll be getting in the family soon.
Did you have a comment?
I think that it would also be interesting to ask the student teachers how well the placement they were at, how that master teacher implemented the philosophies they're being taught in their program. Because I know that's something that we've been seeing, that we are being taught something in our classes, but we're not seeing it implemented in the classroom. So it's hard to see how we would actually implement it with 18 students as opposed to just, a professor telling us how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would be also very interesting to see.
Very helpful.
Excellent. Commissioner Marks?
But along that way, offering the candidate more flexibility, because I've been a master teacher where programs won't allow people to come into my classroom because we offer such a strange curriculum. And so, and they really want to find out about a new way of learning and a new methodology, and they've been turned away because, and so just having that flexibility, and they've had to fight very hard for that. So, the other side of that coin.
Commissioners, any other comments or questions? Okay, seeing no further comments, this is an information item. And thank you so much, Ms. Hickey and Mr. Taylor. So having no additional items, I adjourn the Educator Preparation Committee. Thank you.
And before we reconvene the next committee, we're going to take a brief 8-minute break and see you back at 10.
Shout out. And of course, everybody at the table. Shush.
I love this part. I know, it's fun. All right. We are getting ready to reconvene. Thank you for being in place. I am now handing the mic to Commissioner Cooney, who will convene the Professional Practices Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do convene the meeting of the Professional Practices Committee. We have 3 items today. For efficiency, we're going to shift our focus a little bit. We'll take 5A and 5C, which should be relatively short and routine, and then turn our attention to item 5B. So 5A is the Division of Professional Practices Workload Report. And Gil Gonzalez, the manager of our Division of Professional Practices, will present. Good morning, Mr. Gonzalez.
Good morning, all. Be a quick item as always. I'm Gil Gonzalez, manager of the Division of Professional Practices, and I'll be doing the monthly workload report numbers. The report contains 6 key measurements for both the current and prior year numbers for comparison purposes. I'll be highlighting the December 2018 workload stats. The total cases are the number of open cases within DPP and within all the units. At the end of December, we had a total caseload of 2825, which is above the new normal range of 26 to 2800 cases, and well above the normal range, the prior normal range, which was 24 to 2600. Cases open for the month of December was 380. And we closed 396. And the committee continues to handle the typical workload, which is now at 107 cases for December. The number of AG cases currently assigned to the AG is 157. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions? We have no public comment cards. This is for information, but are there anything in the statistics that raise a question with anyone or comment? I don't see any. Mr. Gonzalez, thank you very much. Item 5C is going to be presented by Counsel Ani Kendall.
The Education Code 44240 has been amended so that the Commission may designate substitute committee members who may serve during the temporary absence of a regular member. The terms of the current school administrator, Helio Brazil, and the secondary teacher, Sheila Reiskamp, will expire in June of 2019. Dr. Brazil is the current chair of the committee, and Ms. Reiskamp is the current vice chair. Both have served since 2011, and both have expressed their willingness to serve as substitutes when their term expires. Former elementary teacher Mario Moya and public members Tilly Solis, and Marianne Reiskamp, and I apologize, I just lost their names. So, elementary school teacher Mario Moya and the public members Tilly Solis and Marianne Reiskamp have expressed their willingness to serve as well. The substitute members, if they're appointed, will be fingerprinted, take an oath of office, and they will complete required forms. Once they're designated, they'll remain as substitutes until such time as they're no longer willing to serve or they're removed by the Commission. Since the absences occur on short notice, the Commission may designate that each of these individuals can be contacted by staff to serve on short notice. Staff is requesting that the Commission appoint Helio Brazil, Sheila Reiskamp, Mario Moya, Tilly Solis, Mary Jane Roberts as substitute members of the committee, and that each be designated to serve as short-term members. Of course, Dr. Brazil and Sheila Reiskamp would serve after their terms expire. And I see what my problem is. I have made a typo on my notes, and it's Mary Jane, and I keep looking down at it, realizing something's not right in what I'm saying, but couldn't quite figure it out till I got to the end. As all of you know, I'm not very good at names. So it is Mary Jane Roberts, who has served a long time on the committee, and I do know her name, but I apologize for the trip up there.
Okay. Questions, Commissioners? This substitute appointment process is new. It's something we advocated for to cover situations where regular members of the committee are not available to meet for any number of reasons, and this will give hopefully it'll give the committee a full 7 members at each of its meetings, and we all know how grueling and time-consuming those can be. So the more experienced members, the better, I think. But I did have one question, Ms. Kindle. The categories in which the proposed substitute members have served or are serving, does that limit them as to those categories for purposes of substitution, or can they simply substitute for any member who might be absent?
They can substitute for any member. That was considered when the legislation was enacted, and we didn't want to have that limitation.
Good. Okay. Any other comments, questions from commissioners before we vote? Okay, we'll need a motion to approve. Commissioner Gonzalez, and seconded by Commissioner Hind. Any further discussion on the motion? All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposition? Any abstentions? Okay, that covers item 5C. Thank you very much.
And I wanted to apologize to Mary Jane Roberts if she's listening.
All right, 5B. This item will be presented by Katie Hampton, who is on our staff, legal staff, and by Mr. Thomas Lazar of the licensing section of the Attorney General's office. And we also have, again, back, Liz Schneider.
No, actually, this is Antoinette Sincata.
Oh, I'm
yes,
sorry.
I am back. Different person.
I remember seeing you. All right, welcome.
You again.
So, as I understand it, there's going to be a presentation by council, and then we will have questions and public comment following that.
Thank you very much. My name is Thomas Lazar. I'm a Deputy Attorney General in the licensing section of the Office of the Attorney General, and it's a privilege and an honor to be here. We're here today at the request of your staff to make the presentation of these proposed adverse action guidelines. Now, when I say adverse action, I'm also going to refer to them as disciplinary guidelines. The meaning's the same. Briefly, by way of background, our office was approached by your staff with a request to help develop much-needed guidelines to be used by all participants in your adverse action process. And today, I'm going to make a presentation to you to emphasize why we continue to have problems throughout the adverse action process in the absence of the guidelines, and also how each participant in the guideline, in the process, will significantly benefit should you vote to adopt these and initiate a rulemaking proceeding to adopt them as your own guidelines. I'd like to start with reference to the twin goals in all adverse actions. The primary, the paramount goal in all of your adverse actions is the protection of school children, the educational profession, and the public. That's the paramount goal. The secondary goal, where not inconsistent with the first, is the rehabilitation of a credential holder who has committed a violation or multiple violations of the education code so that they can be in the classroom, teach children, and continue in the educational profession. While it's a secondary goal, rehabilitation is critically important. Teachers are extremely valuable, And rehabilitation is so important when it is a case where the misconduct is not so severe that you have to outright revoke the credential, and you can instead put them on probation and put them on the path to rehabilitation so that their credential can be fully restored with your agency. The adoption of adverse action guidelines directly furthers these twin goals by establishing fairness and consistency and uniformity in your cases statewide. You are an agency of statewide jurisdiction. You regulate teachers from Sacramento to San Diego. And it's critically important that we have uniform decisions. We know that substantial fairness and justice is furthered when you have transparency, you have advance notice, and you have consistency in the discipline that you're imposing. A teacher committing a specified violation in Sacramento ought not to be treated substantially more harshly or substantially more leniently than a teacher committing that same violation in San Diego. The adoption of the guidelines will also provide notice and certainty to your credential holders that if they commit specified violations, this is the range of discipline that is likely to be imposed. It also provides guidance, much needed guidance, to all of the participants in your adverse action process as to what you expect. Think about this. The guidelines themselves are your primary method, your voice in how you communicate to each of the participants in the entire process what you expect for in terms of adverse action for specified violations of the Education Code. The legislature has given you a mandate to administer and enforce the code. It's your job to impose adverse action in those cases where protection of school children is paramount and rehabilitation where at all possible can be utilized to return an educator to the classroom. Now I want to focus in on the problems that currently exist in your adverse action process because of the absence of the guidelines and the significant benefits to each of the participants in your process should you vote to adopt these. Let's start with credential holders. And in order to give you a context, I want to give you a hypothetical case. This isn't a real case. It's a hypothetical case of a teacher who, when he was in college, undergrad, had his first DUI. He was convicted of driving under the influence, blood alcohol, 0.08, right on the line. Was convicted, successfully completed the criminal probation, ultimately became credentialed, and has been teaching in the classroom for 10 years. But now he's suffered a second DUI. And this time, the BAC, blood alcohol, is a 0.21. So now we're talking about almost 3 times the legal limit. Now that's not anywhere near the highest that we've seen in the Office of the Attorney General. You can imagine what we've seen. I think the highest I've ever seen is a 0.39, though others have seen higher. But my point here is that when you have someone with a very high BAC in a subsequent conviction, you know you have an alcohol problem here, and it has to be addressed. Further investigation shows that there have been reports of the individual showing up for work in the classroom with alcohol on his breath. So we have an indication that possible drinking in the morning. Don't have any proof of it, but we have 2 certified records of conviction for DUIs. These can't be relitigated. These come into evidence before an administrative law judge as conclusive evidence of the convictions. And the police officers would take the stands as well and talk about the nature and the circumstances and facts surrounding the arrest. Now, in that hypothetical case, I want you to focus in first on the credential holder. He's appeared before your committee. He's testified. And he's indicated that he's had some problems with depression and he was self-medicating with alcohol. And he's got a letter from his psychiatrist that he's under treatment. And he immediately went to Betty Ford, which is really important. First steps on the road to rehabilitation, and successfully completed an inpatient at Betty Ford. So he's on the road to recovery. But he's not going to accept the committee's recommendation, so he wants a hearing. The matter is referred to our office, and we file an accusation on behalf of your executive director to initiate the adverse action process. So that's where we stand. Now I want you to picture that credential holder at home, and in the mail, he gets a copy of the accusation. Now what's the first thing he's going to do? He's going to read that accusation, and he's going to think about, well, okay, how bad could this get? Am I going to lose my credential? So he goes to your website. No guidelines. Nothing to look at. He sees multiple violations. He's been charged with unprofessional conduct. He's been charged with moral turpitude. These are serious violations of the code. He's got multiple DUIs, but he's got no guidance. Now, he may decide he's going to represent himself. We oftentimes have respondents represent themselves, and they don't go to knowledgeable counsel who can give them great advice in CTC matters. That means throughout the entire process, he's got no idea what you want and no idea what the ultimate penalty might be. He might go to your website, but he doesn't know the name of individuals who have been disciplined for similar conduct. So there's no way that he could find anything on the website that's really going to help him and inform him and give him a basis for a reasonable decision. Should I try to settle this case or should we fight it out? Now let's say, so that's the credential holder. Let's say he goes out to hire counsel. Now if he has the benefit of someone, and we deal with a very experienced counsel in CTC cases who have great knowledge in the area, and then we deal with defense counsel who don't know a thing about your cases. So let's say he hires his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law is an attorney, but he practices family law. It's not going to be a lot of help. So defense counsel then goes to your website to look for guidelines. Nothing. He's going to meet with the client. He's got to give advice to the client, but he's got no basis to say, well, in similar cases, the commission has done this in the past, and you should seriously consider, since this is a conviction case, there's not a lot to argue about here, let's talk about possible settlement. So the case is in our office. The Deputy Attorney General needs to get settlement authority. Someone like myself would give a call to Ms. Hampton, who is our client representative for settlement authority, and she has been delegated that authority from your executive director, and we would talk about the case. Now, if I had guidelines, before I picked up the phone to call her, I'd be looking at the range of what you expect. And my recommendation would be within that range. But, and this is important when you look at these guidelines, these are not binding. Now you might ask yourself, what does that mean? That means every case is different in terms of the severity of the misconduct. It varies. There's also either the presence or absence of mitigating factors or aggravating factors. Now, in the hypothetical I gave you, the individual has already been through Betty Ford. We already have indications that this person has been subjected to biological fluid testing and have been clean and sober now for several months. And they have accepted personal responsibility for the misconduct. And when the police officers' reports were looked at, there wasn't any fighting. There wasn't any, and we've seen it all, fist fights, all of it. There wasn't any of that. This is an individual who took responsibility for what they did almost from second one. So without guidelines, I call up Ms. Hampton and we talk about the case and try to come up with a settlement that's going to be appropriate. Now that settlement is then communicated to defense counsel, who again doesn't know much about CTC cases, and he says, well, my client would like to have a settlement conference at the Office of Administrative Hearings. We'd like to appear before an administrative law judge who's assigned to the settlement conference so we can talk about the case, because we think you're too harsh. Let's say the settlement that we're looking for is revocation stayed, a term and condition of probation. Obviously, you have authority to put people on probation. Let's talk about that for just 1 second. Under the code, the education code, the legislature has made clear that you have the authority to outright revoke a credential. Of course, you have the lesser included authority to stay that order of revocation in appropriate cases and place the individual on probation so that you can rehabilitate them. Teachers are far too valuable to be outright revoking them when you can put them on probation and get them through probation and get them back in the classroom or keep them in the classroom while you're monitoring them on the road to rehabilitation. So we go to the settlement conference and we walk into chambers and defense counsel is there and respondent is there and the administrative law judge is there and the deputy attorney general is there. Now, before the conference, the administrative law judge, getting ready for the conference, was thinking, well, okay, what's the agency want? Normally, if I'm handling a settlement conference for a nursing board case or a medical board case, I go to the guidelines. What does the agency expect for these violations? The administrative law judge walks down the hallway to the presiding judge and asks her, do you have any guidelines? Does this agency have any guidelines? No. Well, what am I supposed to do in terms of trying to get these parties to agree to a settlement? Do your best. Look at guidelines of other agencies. I can give you some old CTC cases, but I'm not sure if they were adopted or not. There's not a lot for an administrative law judge to do. So, not surprisingly, the case doesn't settle. So now we're on our way to an administrative hearing. Now, a different administrative law judge is going to hear the case on the merits because you can't have the same judge hearing settlement who hears confidential information from both sides and then hears the case on the merits. So we have a brand new administrative law judge. And we go to the hearing. Deputy Attorney General, such as myself, presents the certified records of conviction. I call the police officers. We go through all the facts and circumstances of the arrest. Respondent takes the stand on direct. I cross-examine him. His psychiatrist takes the stand. Documentary evidence comes in. And here's the testimony from the psychiatrist. Respondent has been clean and sober for 9 months now. He's on antidepressant medication, and as long as he stays clean and sober, as long as he stays going to AA, as long as he stays in psychotherapy and on his medication, he's safe to be in the classroom. I don't think we're going to have a relapse. The administrative law judge, case is over, matter submitted, now writing a proposed decision to you. Now remember, it's just a proposed decision because you have final decision-making authority, not the ALJ. So while he's writing that proposed decision, he makes all the findings. Clearly the case has been established. There is a need for public protection. But he concludes that rehabilitation is appropriate here because this is an individual who's already several steps down the road. His recommendation will not be outright revocation because it's not necessary here. You've seen scores of cases where there's no question that this individual that you're dealing with needs to be outright revoked and has no business being in the educational profession. And I'm talking about predators. I'm talking about the individuals who prey on children. That's not the case we're talking about here in my hypothetical. We're talking about somebody who has committed violations of the code. We need to address the addiction problem, but they can be on probation. In writing the proposed decision, no guidelines. No idea what you want. So, That's why you're seeing multiple cases that you're not happy with and you're not prepared to vote to adopt, because the language is all over the place. The penalty is different from case to case to case, and similar cases are being treated substantially different. And that's a problem. So then you have to non-adopt. But let's say in my hypothetical, you get the decision and the language is okay. It's not exactly what you would want. You would prefer other terms and conditions that would be more appropriate. Biological fluid testing, you'd like to keep this person monitored. You want to be really careful about them because you don't want them falling off the rails. And you're not able to do anything. But you decide this is close enough. I'm going to vote to adopt this, and the commission votes to adopt it. Respondent gets a copy of that decision in the mail and immediately goes to his defense attorney and says, "Look at this." And they talk about it, and he's real unhappy. He does not want to accept this at all. And he wants to fight it in Superior Court. So, decision's made, and they file a petition for writ of mandate to challenge your final decision in Superior Court. And once again, it's assigned to a Deputy Attorney General, and there's a client shift at this point. Up to that point, we represent your Executive Director. But once you issue a final decision, and our job is to defend that final decision, we represent you, the Commission. And a deputy such as myself appears in Superior Court, and we're on a petition for writ of mandate, and here's the claim that's being made, and it's the same claim in almost every case. That the penalty that you imposed was arbitrary and capricious. And one of the first things I would expect the Superior Court judge to say to me is, "Mr. Lazar, does this agency have any disciplinary guidelines?" "No, Your Honor." The absence of those guidelines means each individual Superior Court judge across this state doesn't have the benefit of knowing what you expect as the recommended range for specified violations of the code. And they're left to their own devices. We have, where there are disciplinary guidelines, published opinions from courts of appeal relying on disciplinary guidelines to support their finding, no, this penalty imposed by the agency is within the recommended range, and therefore it is not arbitrary and capricious, and it's affirmed. That's an example of how everyone within your entire adverse action process is either significantly that the absence of the guidelines creates a host of problems for each of the participants in your process, and if you do have the guidelines, how each significantly benefits. But there's another point, and I think this is important, and I'll emphasize it for a second time because I think it warrants it. We know that substantial justice is furthered when individuals are treated fairly, consistently, in a uniform fashion. They know what their licensing agency expects of them and what their licensing agency is going to do in terms of adverse action if they violate the code. There's a powerful deterrent effect when you know what the guidelines state. You could post the guidelines on your website. They would be readily available to all applicants and credential holders. Now I want to move at this point in the presentation, if I may, to a discussion very briefly of Morrison. I know you all know about Morrison. And it's the seminal case, of course, in the field of education. It was actually argued by a friend of ours, former Deputy Attorney General Anthony Summers, back in 1969. And we know what that case stands for. Primarily, that case stands for the proposition that if adverse action is going to be taken, it must be done where the basis of that adverse action, there's a fitness to teach, bears on fitness to teach. The misconduct must bear on fitness to teach. If it doesn't, and there are various factors identified by the court to help in that analysis, and you've also promulgated a regulation as well to assist in that analysis, the courts have indicated that Morrison is a threshold analysis. You do it at the threshold, at the beginning. Before you decide to file charges against a credential holder, you go through the Morrison factors to see whether or not the alleged misconduct bears on fitness to teach. And if it doesn't, you don't file the action. These disciplinary guidelines are not a threshold analysis. These are at the other end of the spectrum. These are at the end, when established violations of the code have been identified, and either by way of stipulation, the credential holder admits the misconduct, or it's been proven by clear and convincing evidence to a reasonable certainty in front of an administrative law judge, the proposed decision has come to you and you've adopted it. That's when these guidelines come into play. Because that's when we're determining for specified violations, what is the range that you expect? Now, that being said, I'd like to move at this point to the guidelines themselves. And as I indicated previously, we're here today at the request of your staff, but I also want to point out that we were asked quite some time ago to participate in the design and development of these proposed guidelines for you. And I am one of the co-authors, and the other co-author on your side is your own CTC staff counsel, Katie Hampton. And I can't tell you, it's been a extreme, we just met for the first time today, but it's been a real pleasure working with her because she has brought to bear the institutional knowledge of your agency to ensure that these reflect, to the greatest extent possible, your past practice in terms of what is the range of adverse action that you would impose for specified violations. Now, these would be, if you were to vote today to initiate the rulemaking proceeding and adopt these would be your first edition. Are they set in stone? No. I want to show you a copy here. This is the Medical Board of California's disciplinary guidelines. This is their 12th edition. When I came in the office of the Attorney General in 1985, I think they were on their 5th edition back then. They are developed over time. They're improved over time. Every written document can be improved upon, with the possible single exception of the Gettysburg Address. I think it's probably as good as it gets. But every document can be improved upon. And would I expect, if you were to vote to adopt these would have a 2nd edition and a 3rd edition, of course, because they can be improved upon. What was done here is we have looked at the guidelines of agencies across the state of California. Within the Department of Consumer Affairs, there are 41, to the best of my knowledge, 41 separate agencies that regulate and enforce the practice acts of various professions and vocations. With very few exceptions, the vast majority, overwhelming vast majority, have had their own disciplinary guidelines for years. It's actually very surprising that the Commission, regulating the important profession of education and educators, doesn't yet have its own guidelines. This would be a gigantic step forward in your enforcement program to provide the transparency and the certainty and the guidance that deputies need in our office, that defense counsel need, that ALJs need, so that when you get a proposed decision, it's something you expect based on the established misconduct. You look at it, and you're looking at the terms and conditions that are imposed, and you see that it's within your recommended range, and if it deviates, and this is what I meant by not being binding. Let's say you have a case and the misconduct is not so severe that you need to outright revoke, but it's significant, and you have overwhelming evidence of rehabilitation. And you have early acceptance of responsibility. I think early acceptance of responsibility is one of the most important steps on the road to rehabilitation. I can remember having a case years ago of an RN who gave the wrong medication to a patient and right off the bat took responsibility for that. Right after it happened. It was a mistake. Did we have to deal with it? Of course. But that's an example of early acceptance of responsibility. When you have those factors present in a case, you will be more inclined to deviate from the guidelines downward to a lesser adverse action because you don't need to impose severe adverse action in order to protect the public. You've got someone who has already taken responsibility for themselves. Conversely, in my hypothetical, if you have a case of an individual who has two DUIs, hypothetically, a BAC that's almost triple the legal limit on the second DUI, a fist fight with the police officers when he was arrested, no rehabilitation, still drinking, and doesn't understand why you filed an accusation against him, you're going to treat that individual in a different way because they haven't even started on the road to rehabilitation, and the concern of protection of school children is your paramount duty. So you're going to oppose an adverse action, commensurate with the misconduct and the aggravating factors. No rehabilitating efforts. So in looking at these guidelines, you will see they're broken into a number of sections. There is a table of contents, of course, and it goes through the regulatory authority for the guidelines themselves. And let's talk about that for a second. The legislature has given you broad authority and a legislative mandate to administer and enforce the education code, and at the same time that they gave you that responsibility, they also gave you the authority, the express statutory authority, to promulgate appropriate and reasonable regulations in order to implement the code. You have, for years, promulgated regulations in order to do that. You base that on your general authority, like all other administrative agencies, to promulgate regulations. The legislature is not required, nor does it, give you a grocery list of those items in the statute that you're allowed to promulgate regulations about. You are charged with enforcing the education code and imposing adverse action in appropriate cases to protect school children. A regulation adopting disciplinary guidelines in order for you to be able to do that efficiently and provide very important notice to your licensees, your credential holders, at critical times so they can make informed decisions about whether or not they want to pursue a settlement, whether or not they want to litigate it, and defense counsel and deputies attorney general who represent your executive director and superior courts and courts of appeal is well within your statutory authority to implement regulations. That being said, the guidelines also include a statement of the aggravating and mitigating factors that you've already placed in regulation. Standard adverse orders is another topic covered. We don't want administrative law judges coming up with their own language on what a standard order is. It's your order. It's a proposed decision being done for you. They should look the same so that you can quickly get through the decision and see what unique conditions or optional conditions are being applied so that you can see if it's appropriate for the discipline that was established. And in that sense, we now have 12 standard terms and conditions of probation that are listed. Very few of these are new, but I do want to call a couple to your attention. One is number 5. It's entitled Interviews with the Commission. It requires those who are on probation to be available for interviews by their probation monitor. The word interview is new, but in substance it's the same. A probation monitor would contact their credential holder in order to stay in communication with that individual to ensure that they're complying. Remember, when you put a credential holder on probation, we want them to succeed. That's the goal. The goal isn't to set them up. The goal is to set them up to successfully complete probation. And these terms and conditions are written in a way that puts a burden on the credential holder to provide information to your staff on a timely basis to ensure that they remain in compliance. And if they comply with the terms and conditions of probation, their credential will be fully restored at the end of that probationary term. Now, one of the new ones I would like to call to your attention is number 10. And this standard term and condition is probation monitoring costs. And this is an important thing for you to consider. You have not previously had probation monitoring costs. This is new. Now, I can say that the vast majority of agencies in the Department of Consumer Affairs impose probation monitoring costs on those individuals whom they place on probation. And there's a reason for that. I don't know how many credential holders are here in the hearing today, but should you be paying for the costs of probation monitoring for those individuals through your licensing fees for those individuals who are on probation? No, you shouldn't. If an individual is on probation and there's a cost associated with that, in terms of having a probation monitor, it'll be imposed on them. Now, how that the amount, how that will be determined, Katie and I have talked about this. You would take the number of probationers on probation for a given year. A calculation would be made of the number of hours needed to monitor them while on probation and associated costs. That would then be divided by months, and you come up with a yearly figure. An individual who comes on probation, say in June, is not going to pay a full year of probation monitoring costs. They would pay from June to December, and then the next year they're on probation, they would pay the full year in advance. So that's a new term and condition that will help offset the cost of individuals who are placed on probation. Now, we then go into the optional probation conditions. And the vast majority of this, once again, is new. And is consistent with your established practice. And I'm going to point out those things that are new for your attention so you can see how they further public protection and also at the same time further rehabilitation. Starting off with condition number 14, this is the condition. You have scores of cases, as you know, that deal with substance abuse. We all know and have read across the nation the news stories involving the abuse of opioids, other controlled substances. Chronic abuse of alcohol continues to be a problem. And we also know that when an individual runs afoul of the statutes that regulate them, it's no different than for attorneys. An attorney gets a DUI, they're going to hear from the state bar. if you're a physician and surgeon in the state of California and you are arrested and convicted of a DUI, you are going to hear from the medical board of the state of California. So where we have an individual who has a substance abuse problem and they're placed on probation, they would be subject to the abstention from the possession and use of mood-altering substances. Now you might note that there's a caution included in there. It's on page 9. It's second paragraph from the bottom. Why is that in there? You don't need to tell your credential holders that, because we want to put them on notice. We want them to succeed. We don't want them to ingest something that they shouldn't be ingesting and then run afoul once we get a test back from the laboratory that they're testing with, and now we're going to revoke them when we could avoid that. The next term and condition here that is critically important is under the banned substances testing. Now, once you place somebody on probation, and you're going to have them on probation for a number of years because they have a chronic addiction problem, and they're going to be subjected to testing to ensure that they remain clean and sober, we have a provision in here that provides that the testing shall include but not be limited to by the laboratory. The laboratory does this. Biological fluid testing, urine, blood, saliva testing, hair, fingernail, breath testing. Now, why do we have those additional testings? As a general rule, those won't be used. But we have a problem, and this is how we address it. There are some individuals who are subjected to daily testing for substance abuse, and I say daily. They make a phone call into the lab to find out if they have to come down that day for testing. They never know if they're going to be called in. They're called in on a random basis, but they never know if they have to show up to provide a biological fluid sample so that it can be tested. They're not tested every day. That would be impossible. But there are individuals who try to game the system. And this is how they do it. They drink a lot of water. And I don't just mean some water. They drink gallons of water. So then, when they go in to be tested, you have a diluted test. That's a problem. Because there's an established laboratory cutoff that they're defeating by drinking so much water. In those cases, it may be appropriate then to order them in for an additional test, and it would be a saliva test or hair follicle test. A test so that we can determine what's going on. And they would know, if you keep this up, this is how the testing is going to go. So, knock it off. That's basically what that's in there for. These guidelines have in them ways in which we can deal with the problematic individuals on probation, yet at the same time keep them on the path to rehabilitation and ensure that they successfully complete probation. The next matter I'd like to call to your attention is under alcohol and drug treatment. And again, in some cases, you may order alcohol and drug treatment and that the individual participate in such a program. We have a term and condition here that the program director would be responsible for submitting reports to your staff to ensure that the individual who is in treatment is safe to practice, is safe to be in the classroom. And if he or she is not safe to be in the classroom, you would get notification of that, and we can deal with it. Now, under biological fluid testing, I failed to raise one point, and this is critically important. Typical case, let's go back to that hypothetical case that I mentioned, the 2 DUIs. Now he's on probation. We've gone to the Superior Court. We've gone to the Court of Appeal. It's upheld. Now he's on probation for 5 years. No guidelines. He falls off the wagon. Catches a 3rd DUI now. Now we know statistically, after 2 DUIs, unless the person remains clean and sober, they're likely to get a 3rd. statistically a person drives on multiple occasions under the influence before they're actually apprehended. Okay, you get notification, we've got another case, and we start the process all over again. Meanwhile, he's still in the classroom. Meanwhile, he's still teaching children. Nothing's being done. And we have months go by while a new accusation is filed, and we go through the whole process again. And maybe a year or so later, we finally get an ultimate decision. Adopt the guidelines, that's not how things work. Catches another DUI, gets notification from your staff that his credential is immediately suspended. Now, if you're going to immediately suspend a credential, we know that the requirements of due process of law require a prompt, very prompt, post-deprivation hearing. You've deprived him of the credential by way of notification, and now he's getting notification that his credential has been suspended. Under these guidelines, within 30 days, an accusation or a petition to revoke probation is to be filed against him. 30 days. And if he requests a hearing, we're not going to be waiting on the calendar at the Office of Administrative Hearings for months and months and months to get a hearing. He has a right to a hearing within 30 days. And if we don't comply, the accusation or petition to revoke probation is not filed in 30 days, or he doesn't get the hearing within 30 days of his request, they can always stipulate to a later hearing. But he doesn't get his hearing, that order dissolves. His credentials are fully restored. Can't wait around 6 months while a person's out of work. They have a right to a quick hearing if you're going to take this kind of action. And again, that provision exists under biological fluid testing, banned substances testing, and of course in the other cases where it's appropriate, and that will be your mental illness cases. Again, if you have an individual who you have on probation, who is mentally ill, but is on medication, and is safe to be in the classroom as long as they stay on their medication. We all know that there are lifelong conditions. Alcoholism is one, bipolar is another. As long as a person who has bipolar is on their medication and they're safe, they can be in the classroom and continue to be a teacher. But if you get a notification from a psychiatrist that this person has stopped coming in from treatment, is no longer getting their prescription for their medication, and you have indications from the school district that there are problems in the classroom, then you know you need to immediately take action, and these guidelines allow you to do so. Again, we're not going to wait months and months and months and set public protection aside while we have this process drag on. A few other things I'd like to call to your attention. I think that's it for the conditions themselves that I would like to mention. When you get to page 18, 19, and a little bit on page 20, you're going to see the list of violations. Now, it's important to recognize that the legislature has defined for you numerous violations of the Education Code for which you have no discretion. These are mandatory denials or mandatory revocations. It's no different than other agencies, and they have defined for you what those are. These guidelines do not include the mandatories. These list the Education Code provisions which you're charged with enforcing for which you do have discretion to issue a decision short of outright revocation. So that's what these address. Now again, one of the things I'd like to point out, and I'd ask Katie to talk about this as well, is when we get into the recommended range of adverse action, these reflect in large measure your past practice. And while some of this may be new, while some of the ranges may be different. I would emphasize to you, these are ranges within which you expect a decision unless there is significant reason to depart from this range. And where there is, you've directed an administrative law judges in preparing their proposed decision to point out that deviation and their reasons for proposing it, so you can judge whether or not it's acceptable to you. But again, in terms of the past practice, I thought I would.
So Tom and I basically worked for about 8 months on this, and during that time, one of our main goals was to make this as consistent as possible with your prior decision and orders. And I think that we've come pretty close to achieving that. But of course, if you feel differently, this is just a draft. We welcome any feedback.
And that's important to point out. If you were to vote today to initiate a rulemaking proceeding, that's all you'll be doing. That doesn't mean tomorrow these guidelines go into effect. No. There's as you know, there's a whole process where we would expect input and individuals and organizations to weigh in on their thoughts and concerns so that they can all be taken into consideration during the rulemaking process, which is the appropriate way to get that done. So again, other than that, I think I've covered everything in the presentation of these that I wanted to note, and I would stand ready, willing, and able to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lazar. That was covering a huge amount of material in an efficient 44-minute time frame.
Okay.
We're going to go to public comment in a minute, but first, I think Executive Director has one comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Council. We appreciate very much your all of the work that you've done on this and this opportunity to have a public discussion of a fairly important set of ideas. I'd just like to clarify for the record how these got here and how they were initiated. When our work moved from the Health, Education, and Welfare Division of the Office of the Attorney General to the Licensing Division, working with Linda Schneider, she began recommending early on many of the things that you've recommended at this table, that we adopt decision guidelines. That was reiterated at our budget hearing last spring, where Linda and I presented together to the Senate Budget Committee an update on the backlog at the Attorney General's Office of Cases. The legislature's been very interested in that. In the course of that discussion, she also presented in that committee the need for us to have decision guidelines, and the Senate Budget Committee strongly urged us to take this up and bring this forward. Further, when Linda Schneider has been able to meet with the Commission and discuss an overall analysis of the whole of our discipline work, she has recommended again to this body in public that we have decision guidelines. So we have been urged very strongly to move in this direction, and as a result of that, I authorized our staff to work directly with you on the development of a set of guidelines. And of course, it is of paramount importance to us that any guidelines we adopt reflect the Commission's practice and practices of discipline, that we are establishing consistency here. That would be a goal of having them, and you've made that case very clearly. So I'm very pleased that our staff has been able to work with you to make sure that the Commission's actions and history on this have been accurately reflected. I also want to recognize, and I appreciate you pointing out for us, that there are a number of recommendations from your office about how to move beyond Commission practice and get more specific in some key areas that are consistent with other licensing areas. And I think the Commission is eager to consider these things and give this, full consideration. But I just wanted to again clarify that there is Commission practice reflected in here, as well as OAG licensing division perspective on how these could be strengthened. So just that point of clarification.
All right, thank you very much. We have 6 comment cards. I think that provided everybody is mindful of the time, that we can allow 3 minutes per speaker. The first speaker is Janet Davis. And Ms. Davis, if you'll mention your affiliation, please, for the record.
Hello, my name is Janet Davis, and I'm representing the California Federation of Teachers. I was very upset when I heard the presentation at the November meeting, and I shared those concerns with the leadership of California Federation of Teachers, and I was more concerned when I read the guidelines that have not been discussed collaboratively with stakeholders. We're very committed, everybody in this room is committed to children's safety. It's very serious, but we don't need to have a sensationalist tone about it, and it needs to be I appreciated the presentation today, by the way, but that needs to be a conversation, not just a presentation. We need to improve. I was here when there was a huge backlog, when cases were on Excel spreadsheets, and we were involved very intimately in that process, and I learned a lot about Morrison and Nexus and all those things. But when the changes were made, I personally felt a lot of ownership about that and total support of what was being done by the Commission. This time I felt sideswiped, and my trust has been broken. We remember the history of Vietnam era when they were taking away teachers' credentials for protesting against the draft, which helped motivate the creation of the CTC. You're here to protect teachers from, and there was a visceral reaction to what has been done without collaboration, that the reason we have you is being compromised. I read that Morrison decision, and was even more, when you actually read what it was about, it was even more disturbing. I appreciated this comment. This is very logical and respectful. However, it has not been a collaborative process, and trust has been broken. I hope the Commission will not approve the rulemaking process until there has been adequate engagement with the stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Our second speaker is Danette Brown. Good morning, Ms. Brown.
Good morning. Danette Brown, representing the California Teachers Association. We were shocked and disappointed when our first look at these guidelines was when it was publicly posted. Let me explain. In November, we heard item 4C presented by Ms. Schneider, the Senior Assistant Attorney General, and she presented about the complex issues surrounding the teacher disciplinary process. One of the items that she brought up was the need for disciplinary guidelines. During the discussion of that item in November, we heard Executive Director Sandy share that we were in the process of developing those guidelines. During her comments in November, she also talked about how engaging stakeholders is a priority for the Commission. She also gave us a shout out and talked about the importance of collaborating with CTA, because we kind of have some experience in the teacher disciplinary area. Ms. Schneider also said, we appreciated her shout out, that CTA has an important perspective to bring to the conversation. At the conclusion of the discussion of that agenda item, there was a formal motion made by Commissioner Klatt, and it was seconded by Commissioner Rodriguez, and you can see that motion in the minutes you just adopted yesterday, and that also spoke to the importance of stakeholder engagement, and it basically was directing staff to engage with stakeholders about these issues. For whatever reason, that has not happened. And that is why we object to taking this and initiating the rule process already prior to engaging your stakeholders, which you have already said is a priority for the Commission. We urge you to take this opportunity to reset the relationships with your stakeholders, to re-engage your stakeholders on this process, because we really strongly believe that the outcome will be improved for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Laurie Easterling, and she'll be followed by Shannon Baker.
Good morning, Commission members. I'm Laura Easterling on behalf of the California Teachers Association. Just following up with what Ms. Danette Brown had suggested, CTA is not opposed to the idea of discipline guidelines, but in how these are been drafted and developed without any input, we've had zero input into these, is wrong. CTA works with countless agencies, the Department of Education, the State Board, the California State Teachers Retirement System, on having conversations, meaningful stakeholder engagement long before there's any official rulemaking process. This is very disappointing. We ask you that you delay this process, talk to us. I know that this has been said that this is just a first draft, but this first draft shouldn't be seen by all of us just 2 weeks ago. These are too important. We're asking you to delay the official rulemaking process, having a meaningful discussion with CTA, AXA, CSBA, CFT, everybody who has a stake in making this right. As it was suggested, we have a lot of experience in this area, and we look forward to those conversations when we can have them thoughtfully. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Easterling. Shannon Baker, followed by Harold Acord.
Good morning. I'm a partner at the law firm of Rothschild, Wishick & Sands. I've been representing teachers for probably over 18 years at this point. My office has been representing teachers before the commission for probably over 40 years. Mr. Rothschild would say longer than I've been alive. And I estimate that my office has represented thousands of teachers before the commission on teacher credentialing. And I also have experience representing other professional licensees before different boards, including the medical board and the nursing board. And I'm familiar with how disciplinary guidelines have been used before those boards. And as the Attorney General said, the purpose of disciplinary action in professional licensing is not to punish the licensee, it's to protect the public. And these proposed disciplinary guidelines are punitive in nature, and I do not think they lead to the protection of the public. It has always been my understanding, and for a very long time has been the practice with the Commission, and based upon my preliminary research in the short period of time we've had to address these issues, it does not appear that the Commission on Teacher Credentialing has the legal authority to place a teacher on probation except through the settlement process. Education Code Section 44421, 4400.5, and Regulation 80300A all refer to the Commission having the authority to issue a private admonition, a public reproval, a suspension, or a revocation. And there is no mention of probation. Other licensing agencies, such as the Medical Board and the Board of Registered Nursing, have statutes that authorize probation, and they also have statutes that authorize imposing the cost of probation to the licensees. And you guys can review those code sections. For the Medical Board, it's Business and Professions Code 2227, and for the Board of Registered Nursing, it's 2759. In addition to not having the authority to place teachers on probation, many of the terms and conditions that have been proposed in these disciplinary guidelines are onerous and cost prohibitive to teachers. Teachers are required to pay all costs associated with probation monitoring, and the Attorney General's office has access to how much this costs for other agencies. And my understanding from talking with nurses that I've represented that the costs of probation are extreme and could be over $10,000. So this isn't a small amount that they're proposing to put on teachers. Few licensing agencies, in my experience, impose suspensions along with probation, and that's what's been suggested in most of the disciplinary guidelines. Actual suspensions recommended by the Committee of Credentials is far less than what's recommended in these proposed guidelines. In addition, The length of probation of 5 to 7 years is excessive under most circumstances and higher than I've seen in other licensing agencies. They're requiring psychiatric evaluations, psychotherapy, and medical evaluations are being mandated under circumstances that are just not justified. And an evaluation by a board-certified psychiatrist is very costly and could cost $7,500 or more than that, depending on whether there's psych testing that's required. And they're required to go anywhere in the state of California to undergo the psychiatric evaluation. If they're required to do therapy, it's not with a licensed marriage and family therapist or a licensed clinical social worker. It's with a licensed board-certified psychiatrist or a board-certified psychologist who has at least 5 years of experience.
Excuse me, Ms. Baker, do you have more to say about how much time would you need?
I just want to reiterate what Ms. Easterling said, is that it is not my position either that disciplinary guidelines in general shouldn't be imposed. But in this case, these particular disciplinary guidelines are excessive and not geared towards public protection.
Thank you very much. Harold Acord, followed by Jane Robb. Excuse me. Good morning, Harold.
No problem. Good morning. My name is Harold Acord. I am a Spanish and German teacher in Moreno Valley, California, and I am speaking on 100,000 plus members of the California Teachers Association, the vast majority, the largest group of credential holders that you oversee. I am a classroom teacher, and as a classroom teacher, I know that building trusting relationships with my students is of the utmost importance. For me to be able to provide the curriculum and for the students to actually learn it, we have to have trust. And to do that, I have to have follow-through, and I have to keep my commitments I make to my students. I have to do what I said I would do, or else my students won't listen. They won't work with me. Here, the commission should have a relationship like that with the stakeholders, all of the stakeholders, including the community. You know, we did review the video last night of what you all decided and promised to the community publicly, and which is online, at the last meeting. One thing that came up often was that nothing should happen without stakeholder input. Multiple times that was said by multiple people right when they were making the motion to follow through and to move forward. We've reviewed the item, and as has been shared, we're shocked about monetary charges and many other items that cause us great concern for our profession. You know, as the California Teachers Association, we worked very hard in the 1970s to create an independent standards board, the California Commission on Teacher Credentialing. We worked hard for that because we believe that we need to be in charge of our own profession. We believe that we together should regulate who's in our profession, who's not in our profession, what should happen if someone doesn't follow the standards of our profession. But that key word is independent. You need to, as the body that represents all of us together as a profession, be able to have the time to work with the stakeholders to truly have something that we all agree on is the best way for dealing with regulating our own profession and being in charge of our own profession. So we don't understand the rush. We don't understand why two people worked in a dark place and did not have open to the light the work that they were putting together and coming together with for us to then have to make comments here on. We want to partner with this group because that's important. It's important that working together, that we're able to preserve trust, that we all mean what we say publicly, and doing what we all promised is exceedingly important. Working together, we're all better. We're better for our students, we're all better for the safety of the public, and we're all better as a profession. So we do ask that you pull this back until we're able to work together and make this happen in the right way, the way that's our culture here, the way that you have all stated publicly that you would like it to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Acord. Jane Robb is our final speaker. If you'll state your affiliation, Ms. Robb.
Sure. Good morning, I think still. I'm Jane Robb from the California Teachers Association. And you've heard our position, but I wanted to just elaborate a little bit why stakeholder engagement is important prior to regulatory hearings, right? Everybody, of course, we need public hearings, we need it all. And I appreciate the perspectives that have been brought by the Attorney General's office and by the staff council here at the Commission. But the point of stakeholder, in my perspective, the point of stakeholder engagement first is not to come to an agreement necessarily. That's wonderful if you all agree with me. I'm good with that, okay? But that's not what the purpose of it is. The purpose of it is to raise perspectives beyond our own world, right? It's so that you get all the issues raised early and completely in a conversational forum rather than in a regulatory process. We all know how the regulatory process works. Even here at the Commission, we have 2 minutes to talk. We can turn in written, feedback. But that doesn't give the opportunity for back and forth. It doesn't give the opportunity for engagement. And that really has to surface first so that you get the best first draft, right? It's not that there won't be changes, but if you don't do the engagement first and the conversation first, all of you that teach understand successive approximation. You get better and better and better every time you try it out, right? So it's your dry run, it's your practice run, so you have the first best draft that goes to the regulatory process. Because the problem is, skipping it actually lengthens the amount of time. You guys know the regulations. You put them out there, you have 15 days for comment, people send in changes, you make changes, you have to send them out for comment again, people make changes, so it just lengthens the process rather than shortening it, okay? The more upfront you can get, the broader perspectives, you know what the issues are. And I just want to remind you of an old adage, right? Which is you never get a second chance to make a first impression. Your regulatory draft is your first impression that goes out. And if it's not good, and if it hasn't included the perspectives from the field that you want in there, you're going to get opposition on your first draft. And it is going to make everyone's job much, much harder. So again, we're just urging you to step back right now, go through the process that you have committed to and that we all believe in, and get the best first draft and get those issues sort of surfaced and discussed. Even if they're not, everybody's not going to agree to the same thing, you're going to have a better first draft. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Robb, and thank everyone for their public comments. Before we go to the Commission, are there any initial comments? Mr. Lazar?
Yes. I'd first like to point out a couple of things. I don't know where the concern is about the probation monitoring costs being exorbitantly high. I don't anticipate that. You would certainly have control of that and could set that figure. It's a figure that's meant not to be, it's supposed to be cost expense neutral. You're not supposed to be making money on it. It's supposed to offset the cost of individuals on probation. And that is something within your full control. It's not as if some figure is going to be arrived at and then just imposed without your final approval. So that's the first thing I would point out. The comment about the lack of authority to promulgate regulations, as I pointed out previously, the legislature has given you broad authority to promulgate regulations that are necessary to implement the act that you are charged with administering and enforcing. This is just such a regulation. And if you look at the code the education code that provides for that authority. It doesn't give you a grocery list of things that you can promulgate regulations about and things that you cannot. It's no different than any other agency. So that particular argument doesn't give me cause for concern at all. The idea of whether or not you can place someone on probation, I think we should talk about. Counsel is correct. The education code does say revocation or suspension or a public reproval, and I believe it has private admonition in there as well. Does it expressly state probation? No. It doesn't need to. And there's a reason for that. As I said, if you can outright revoke a credential, take it away from someone and remove them from the educational profession, you obviously have the lesser included authority of staying that order of revocation and placing the person on probation on terms and conditions that will allow them to rehabilitate themselves. Rehabilitation is critically important, and I would be surprised if anyone in this room would not advocate for rehabilitation of our educators when at all possible, in every case where it's possible and where it's not inconsistent with public protection. The comment that these guidelines are punitive in nature, they are anything but. First of all, they're not binding. I've said it twice previously. They're not binding. There is great flexibility in these guidelines to reach an appropriate level of adverse action based on the severity of the misconduct and then depending on the presence or absence of mitigating factors. You also have other factors. I mean, think about it. If you have a case that's 8 years old from when the events happened, the statute of limitations has been complied with, but the events are very remote. No misconduct in the intervening years. Personal responsibility taken and steps for rehabilitation taken. That is a case that obviously you're not going to impose severe adverse action. Sometimes we have cases where victims and critical witnesses simply will not participate. They don't want to go through it again. They don't want to live it again. They want it behind them. And in those cases, that's a factor that we take into consideration when we make a determination. What can we prove in this case? So when we send an accusation to Ms. Sandy, which is reviewed by her staff, we're telling her, these are the charges we believe we can prove by clear and convincing evidence to a reasonable certainty, which is the second highest evidentiary standard in American law. There's only one higher, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. So the last point I would make, and I think that this is important too, and this is about the whole idea of collaboration. And all of the public comments are correct. That is important. These are representatives of your licensees, of your credential holders, and their input is critically important. This is a first draft. It's not going to become law in its form right now. It's highly unlikely that there would be no changes to this first draft. It's got draft written in red on every single page. And that's because it's just a draft and it's a starting point for the very discussion that you've been asked to engage in. And that's what the rule-making procedures are all about. If you were to vote today to initiate a rule-making proceeding, it starts the process. And I anticipate there would be, based on what I've heard today, much input for you to consider on how you might want to change some of these guidelines, or you might want to consider the reasoned arguments or viewpoints of representatives of your stakeholders. And that's critically important. And we support that. As I said, we're here today having been asked to make this presentation by your staff to move your agency a giant step forward in the field of administrative law. All of us who participate in your adverse action process need the guidance from you. This is your voice, where you tell us what you want. There should not be so much speculation on our side for teachers, their counsel, deputies, your own staff counsel, and especially administrative law judges who you have delegated the hearing responsibility. Some of you might not know this, but you could actually hear every case yourself and sit as the decision maker. And in the old days, agencies used to do that. It's not administratively efficient. So the hearing function has been delegated by you to the Office of Administrative Hearings, and administrative law judges perform that function for you and make rulings and accept evidence and listen to testimony and receive documentary evidence and make a proposed decision for you to consider. And then they're left in the dark. Once they make their findings, what provisions in the education code have been violated? How severe is this? What should be imposed? They're all left to their own devices. What each individual ALJ thinks. And that's where you get the wild variances. And the wild is a strong term. The significant variances from one case to the other ones. And I'm sure there are cases that you are not adopting because you're not happy with them. Get some guidelines, you'll get some uniformity. And I think the last point that I want to make, and I know
This is your second last point.
We
Mr.
have
Rosler.
people who will be leaving for airplanes soon, so I just want to be sure we have a chance for conversation.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
We are, after all, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice is interested in a just result in every case, rehabilitation where at all possible. And in order to accomplish that, if you give us guidelines and give us an indication of what you want in the cases and some uniformity, you will benefit all of the participants in your process.
And may I add something really quickly, just to respond to public comment? I'm not sure it's entirely appropriate to consult with a private entity outside of public knowledge, and that's exactly what the regulatory process is for, is so members of the public can have this sort of back and forth in public session, so other members of the public have knowledge of what's going on. And it's the legal office's advice that you adopt these today and authorize staff to engage in that process. Thank you.
Thank you all. Excellent presentation and emphatic advice received. So, commissioners, we have a limited amount of time today to discuss a lot of material or ask questions, but the floor is open to you. Madam Chair.
Well, first, thanks for the very extensive both memo and conversation. You know, we appreciate learning all of the ins and outs of this, and it's clear that disciplinary guidelines will be productive in multiple ways for us as an agency. I am mindful that we have members of the commission who, because they live multiple airplanes away from here, have to begin departing shortly, and so I want to be sure that we can move to some kind of resolution of this and other business on our agenda relatively quickly, and it's something that requires a lot of attention and discussion and so on. I take the point that a broad public conversation is needed. I do think we need more time for that broad public conversation, and I think that this is clearly a good direction for us to be moving. But my own view would be that we should come back to, we should ask the staff to have a conversation, not with a single agency, but with members of the public, as we do on many other issues, where we convene conversations between now and our next meeting so that we can really give this our full attention and have the benefit of stakeholder involvement before we start the rulemaking process. So that would be my own personal inclination. I'd certainly love to hear from others if we can do that quickly and get the sense of the commission before we start to lose folks to their transportation.
Commissioner Hartwick.
I echo the need to have a broad public conversation. I did just hear from Attorney Hampton that she thinks there might be some legal concerns about having that kind of a pre-regulatory, pre-rulemaking public consultation. Could you elaborate on that? Because if that is not
All I mean is,
Yeah.
all I mean is that the regulatory process was created for that specific purpose. So we have these conversations out in the open and out in the public.
Could you just
Can I add to that, please? Because it is not the case that it is illegal for us to have conversation with the public about items that are coming before the commission. And Katie Hampton is correct that the Title V rulemaking process provides for a very public, very structured way for that to happen. In fact, we had commentary from our colleagues in the CTA this morning thanking us for the opportunity to collaborate on the development of regulations that ultimately we accepted their amendments to and adopted. So that process can be long, it can be drawn out, but it invites all of the public to come forward in the structured process to get us there. That does not preclude our ability to have conversation with stakeholders ahead of bringing the next item. And that's something we're absolutely committed to doing. Chief Counsel Vanessa Whitnell has a strong working relationship with the attorneys at CTA, and I know they've been in conversation and will continue to be in conversation as we work to bring some regulations before you. I also just simply want to say again that these were brought to us at the request of the Attorney General's office. They were developed under an attorney-client privileged communication as we dig into the case files, and we helped them to understand what consistent commission practice has been. That's not a process and a conversation we can bring any member of the public into. So this product was developed over the last 8 months by the Attorney General's office with support and understanding from our legal staff to get us to this point. And we are bringing it at their recommendation to you today, and with our consent to open the conversation today. But we are deeply committed to a collaborative relationship with our stakeholders, and they know this, and they should never forget this. This is an important starting point in a conversation, and we will continue it with your direction and feedback. It's important to get that direction and feedback from you as well, however, with regard to whether you think we should even have decision guidelines. And if that's the case, you've heard a lot today, and you have a lot to read and process, and what you would recommend for us to do is the next question for you.
Bonnie?
Because of the limited time, I think it seems prudent to delay, but I guess I am concerned by what Ms. Hampton said. It seems reasonable to me to try to keep it as out in the public as possible. So I guess my preference would be that perhaps, and I don't know if it's possible, but that we agendize this for the next meeting rather than have meetings happening not in the public around the issue, I guess.
You know, I think we're talking about two different things. There is a process, and we have the ability to initiate it today, or we have the ability to delay it in order to ameliorate the allegation that a lot has been presented here without any collaboration at all. And I think that is a step back in our relationship. So nothing prohibits us from delaying this to our April meeting, and as staff does all the time, communicate with stakeholders. It doesn't have to be done in this hearing room. And in fact, if we insisted on everything being done here, we wouldn't have any progress at all. So I don't want to defeat any other comments by that. I'd rather take all the time we have to satisfy commissioners as to the appropriate course of action. But if there are any other comments, let's hear them. Commissioner Wall.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I think that the adoption of disciplinary guidelines is exceptionally important. Coming in new and experiencing I'm going to call it a cascade of materials, and then discussions that ultimately are about consistency, I think that it advances the field tremendously to have that guidance. So that's point one. Then there's the question of process, right? So I would differentiate my thinking between the need for them and then the process by which that happens. And I think is more challenging if, you have an important community that doesn't feel as though they've been engaged, because it can threaten even their articulated support for the idea of guidelines. So then it might be prudent to seek that consultation but continue to move it forward. I hope that our partners might help us to proceed towards the goal, would be my comments on that.
Thank you. Commissioner Harwick?
I would echo those comments as well. I do think these are so significant for our agency that we do want to move forward expeditiously because we know how important they are, but also with as full input as possible. And I heard the important comments about understanding different perspectives as we decide what are the best route to take with these. I had one question that I thought would be helpful for me and perhaps for the commissioners to have a little deeper understanding of how the proposal as it is does reflect our past practice. I understand that Ms. Hampton and others did significant work to try to align what is in this document with what we have actually decided before, which we know is a major goal of consistency. And that would actually be helpful for me just at this process and before any other discussions are done outside of this room. I think to hear in any non-confidential way that you can describe what the steps were that you took to make this document reflect what the decisions have been in this from this body before.
Mainly our settlements and what you have adopted as your final decisions. That was the process. I can't get into specifics, but Tom has delineated very well the precise differences from your historical practice. But this, as far as coming to what we have today, that was sort of the thought process, is what the commission as a whole has adopted and what the final decisions are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and what was the time period that you were looking at in terms of?
Well, I've only been here for about 2.5 years, so maybe about 2.5 to 3 years.
Of our prior decisions.
Right, and I know that there's been conversation with general counsel as well to go even further back than that.
Okay. Commissioner Hine?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your great presentation, Mr. Lazar. I really appreciated the way you outlined everything. I think that, and our stakeholder comments, not only because, I seconded the motion that Danette mentioned, they didn't fall on deaf ears at all, because I really believe in, there's a good and the good in the Platonic view, which are the guidelines, and there's a greater good, and that's the collaboration and the input that we have together. And so based on that, I'd like to make a motion that we postpone this, that we bring this to, if there's a way to bring stakeholder involvement into this conversation and table it for our next meeting to make a decision.
I don't believe you need to make a motion to do that, and I'm not sure that tabling it is the right technical thing to do. But I think what you're asking us to do, if I'm getting you, is to have the conversations that are now available since we have a public document, and to come back to you at a future meeting. And I think I'm also hearing from you, Commissioner Hartwig, that you'd like a greater understanding of what within the document we bring forward reflects commission practice as it has been, and to separate out or identify specifically which recommendations are coming on top of that from the Attorney General's office. Is that what you're asking us to do?
I think that would be very helpful for our consideration of consistency of our practice.
We welcome the opportunity to do that.
Commissioner Hine?
I just wanted to add also, after hearing both the presentation and the comments from our stakeholders, that I would hope that it would be clear that this document could not have been created with collaboration with stakeholders because there's so much confidential information that went into creating it. So I look at it in a totally different way, not leaving our stakeholders out, but being able to create something using all the confidential information that we have and the cases that we've seen, and the decisions that we've had to make to create an outline, a skeleton, a beginning spot so that we could bring something, to our stakeholders and say, here's what we can share with you now that we've protected the rights of all of those credential holders whose information should not be made public. Here's what we've created, and now we can move forward. So I don't actually see it as anyone being left out and as stakeholders not being included. I think that the thousands of hours that probably went into creating this happened confidentially to protect those credential holders and the students and the instances that cannot be shared with everybody else. So I wanted to make that clear. And I think it's actually really well done. So thank you.
Commissioner Klatt and then Commissioner Kung. I'm sorry. Where is she? I was looking at her nameplate.
I know so much more now, and I'm really glad that I do. I think we all do. And I think that's what we need. We needed an education in order to look at and establish a really important need for disciplinary guidelines. And it's a starting point. So I would have to absolutely endorse what Vice Chair Hines said about now we know more, and now we need to do the next step, which is to have that engagement so that when we do come forward with guidelines, they've both protected people, and they will do that they will help the Commission make better decisions, and that for the 4 years that I've been on here is very needed. So the need is here. Now it's time to work the process.
Thank you, Commissioner Kung.
I agree with Commissioner Hines in that, first that we need these guidelines and thank you staff for creating this. This had many hundreds, thousands of hours it must have taken to do this. We need this to protect our students, the children. I mean, that's the main point of this. And though also understand that we need feedback from stakeholders. So it's a challenge because I know that we need these guidelines and we need it in a quick time period so that we can protect our students.
Very good. Commissioner Marks?
Well, I just, my thoughts were just about process, and I thought that the process was firmly established and that we had timelines and stakeholder meetings, and so I guess my question doesn't even need to be answered now, but it was like, what is the established process for these rulemaking situations? And in every institution group I've worked with, you have to research the information before you bring in the stakeholders. So I would like to reiterate what all the other commissioners have said. We have to meet to work with and really massage now and get input now. And I would hope we wouldn't stop here, but now our energy would be in engagement with the community.
Commissioner Barnes?
I like the clarification earlier about how this actually was a different process than in the past because of all the confidential information. So I guess I want to make clear, so if we recommend to approve, what happens? If we don't recommend to approve, what happens? I'm kind of confused of what the next steps would be, whichever way. I've heard all the feedback and everybody's concerns, but I'm not sure. I don't want to stall the process, so.
Well, what's been suggested is that we not act today to adopt these guidelines, but to take it up at our April meeting.
And then what does that mean in the interim? Okay.
Can I just add to that? It's the rulemaking process can take a very long time, especially when you have a complex set of controversial potential regulations, because there will be many stakeholders who are interested in what rules we might establish in regulations. So it involves public hearing. It involves putting something out for the public and inviting widespread public comment. every public comment that comes in requires a staff full analysis and response that also goes into the public record. So that's when I talk about this being a highly structured process, that's what I mean, that the public comment itself that comes in on regulations that you direct us to promulgate, when you open the rulemaking process, that's what begins, is that structured process. But that does not preclude us from having conversation prior to them coming to you. I saw these for the first time about 10 days ago, before we published them on the commission agenda. It's been a work in progress for quite some time, and our staff has been working to make sure that your work is reflected accurately in this. And so it's new to all of us and requires now for us to have communication with our stakeholders about it so that you have the best information possible and our best recommendation when we bring it forward to you again. I think that the recommendation from our colleagues at the Attorney General's office and the staff support for the recommendation to open that rulemaking file today was intended to get the public process started. But that, I think we are well advised to postpone that actual formal decision until we've had a chance to actually engage with these materials with the broader public. And we'll bring you back something that is informed by that. And we'll also be clear to you, we'll be clear with you and the public about what changes we might make to these before we present them for adoption and regulation. And we'll give you the rationale for that. So it's very important for us to be transparent with you and with the public, and we're committed to that.
And to doing it rapidly.
Rapidly, but I really want to manage expectations here with the understanding that it could take a year to get this all the way through the process. It could, and it often does take a while to get regulations all the way through the process. But I appreciate your desire for movement on this. We appreciate all the framing you gave us on what these are and how they get used. And we've heard clearly that the need for these in the whole enforcement community that works on our cases is really important to bring some stability to decisions that are made by ALJs in the Office of Administrative Hearings. They aren't us. They don't sit at this table. They don't know our deliberations, so they're operating in the dark, and they need some guidance from us. That's what I'm hearing. I think we all would like to provide them that. But we want to make sure that it hits the right mark for this body, and that's the next part of this process.
Commissioner Escobedo.
I'll make my comments quick. I don't want to repeat what was already said, but in terms of process and in terms of moving forward, when we went through agenda item 4E with the PPS credential, you can feel the ownership in the room. And given this topic, it's a big one, just in terms of guidelines and our input from our stakeholders and how we move forward as a commission. I'm hopeful we're going to get there.
Any other comments from commissioners? Is everybody okay with referring this back to staff for presentation at our next meeting? Okay, fantastic. That ends this item, 5B. Thanks again to you, our
It's been an
colleagues from
honor
the
and a
Attorney
privilege
General's
to appear
office.
before you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, I'll turn this back to Madam Chair for the conclusion. Oh, we actually have
We
some
still have some more committees, yeah, and I would like to be sure we have a commission as we're completing our business. Thank you. Next is the Legislative Committee. I'm sure it will be speedy. Commissioner Hind, will you please convene the committee?
I shall. Thank you all for staying. I now convene the February 2019 meeting of the Legislative Committee. The committee has one item before it today. Joshua Speaks will present this item. In item 6A, The item 6A insert, Status of Legislation, contains two parts. The first is a brief summary of the Commission's existing legislative guidelines with some minor suggested changes. The second part is a brief update on the Commission's sponsored legislation and any new bills that have been introduced. Mr. Speaks, will you please begin?
Good morning, Commissioners. I approach the table with a little bit of fear and trembling at this point since I'm also bringing forward guidelines. Fortunately, I don't think that mine will be the subject of quite as much intense discussion. So the Commission has had legislative guidelines. These are The commission's sort of best guidance to staff as we move forward in dealing with legislation between commission meetings. Obviously, things in the legislature happen pretty rapidly, and since you only meet every other month, this document is intended to help guide our decision making in the interim. The changes that we proposed are very minor. You'll notice that we have stricken in the first point, we've stricken the phrase public school teachers and other educators in California and just replaced it with California's educator workforce. It's a briefer term that still encompasses the entire education community. And then the only other change that we've suggested is down in number 7 where it says legislation does not include an appropriate source of funding. One thing we've come to realize over the years is that there are other resources besides funds that are very important, one of the most pressing being staffing. And so we just chose to change that to appropriate resources in order to give that sort of broader understanding of the support that the Commission needs. And really, other than that, since these were adopted by the Commission in February 1995, we just wanted to bring them back before you to make sure that they still represent the Commission's thinking about how they want staff to analyze and treat legislation. That's all I have.
Great. Well, I have no public comment cards. So now I'm closing the public comment period for this item. So commissioners, do you have any questions or concerns for Mr. Speaks? Seeing none, do I have a motion for the commission to approve the updated legislative guidelines? Commissioner, what? I did say guidelines, yes. Commissioner Kung, and a second, Commissioner Barnes. Great. Any further discussion? Excellent. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say no. Motion carries. That was easy. Is there more? All right. That was it?
No, unless you want to update.
Next is update on the legislation that does not require any action. Mr. Speaks, please begin.
In the interest of time, I'll try to be brief. I just wanted to let the commissioners know that the minor policy proposal that you recommended at the last commission meeting, as well as our new assignment monitoring bill for this year, we found authors for both of those proposals. They're not yet in print, so we can't give you bill numbers, but our authors are Assemblymember Luz Rivas for the minor policy proposal and Assemblymember Joan Sawyer for the assignment monitoring proposal. And we've had really good conversations. The staff in both offices have been very helpful, so we're very excited about both of those going forward. You heard that there was also some assignment monitoring language in the budget trailer bill yesterday, and I just wanted to let you know that we are working with Department of Finance and all of our stakeholders to try to make sure that whatever ultimately happens with assignment monitoring, it works for all of our stakeholders. And with that, I just wanted to highlight two things from other legislation of interest. The first is AB 182, also by Assemblymember Rivas, and that is a bill that would create a single subject computer science teaching credential. As most commissioners probably already know, right now there are 3 different credentials that authorize folks to teach computer science courses, but none of them are specialized computer science credentials. They're business, mathematics, and ITE. And so one of the recommendations of the Computer Science Strategic Implementation Plan was to create a single subject computer science credential. And then the only other thing that I wanted to sort of point out, it's not one bill, it's actually a variety of bills, and I've put 3 of them on here as being sort of most salient, is that we're seeing a lot of really interesting and really important work and attention in the early childhood education community. I think that's incredibly timely, and I think it's sort of serendipitous that that's going on at the same time as this commission is also putting a lot of work and thought into that community. And so I just wanted to make you aware of that. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. We have 2 public comment cards. Dean Drescher, you're first. If you please state your name and affiliation for the record.
Make it quick, as you all have been here for a long time. In terms of the sponsored legislation, we intend to be monitoring the bill by Assemblymember Rivas. I'd like to issue our support for the authorization of the data sharing agreement between CTC and CDE. We think that's really great. And in terms of good, robust teacher workforce data, I think that's a really inspiring and encouraging direction to be headed. We're concerned regarding the requirement for more coursework potentially for intern candidates. This is potentially, our concern is that it's a added potential financial barrier for folks from low-income backgrounds who enter the intern credential programs more frequently. So that's a concern that we have, just noting that. In terms of the legislation of interest, I just wanted to go ahead and express our opposition to AB 221, which you have on your list, which would explicitly and by name ban Teach for America teachers from teaching after 2020 and 2021 school year. So just wanted to put that out there for you all, and thank you very much.
Thank you. And next we have Rigel Massaro. If you'd please come and state your name and affiliation for the record.
Good afternoon, Rigel Massaro with Public Advocates, echoing Dean's support of the Rivas piece around really that we leverage the data of that MOU to bring other workforce reports to the legislature, and appreciating we're kind of closing the loop on closing the loophole for the early completion option. Just as Public Advocates did last year, we are very interested in the assignment monitoring proposal, really appreciate the hard work of the Commission staff in bringing this again, persevering, and our two areas of advocacy on that bill really are focused on ensuring that the data, now we're going to have yearly data for all schools on teacher assignments. Wow, amazing. Coming into the 21st century, we would like that data to be usable for locals. And so we know local planning processes. We appreciate the intent language around aligning this to the system of support and priority 1 for LCAP development. For that data to actually be useful for that purpose, it needs to come out, by May of every year so that stakeholders and LEAs can make decisions about their hiring and support practices. If it comes out in the summer, it's kind of like, well, we've got our plan, and we're continuously every year working with stale data. We also have some concerns that Surratt articulated yesterday around cutting out county offices. From our position, there does need to be some sort of oversight and support provided to LEAs around assignments, particularly persistent misassignments. And to our knowledge, there wasn't, the budget trailer did not provide incredible extra resources to the Commission to do that work. So we are concerned about there being no one there to perform that important duty. Look forward to continuing to work with Josh and other stakeholders, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Lunch soon.
Thank you, Rigel. All right, I have no more public comment cards, so the public comment period is over. Commissioners, do you have any questions or concerns? Comments? Seeing none, I will thank you, Mr. Speaks, very much, and this concludes the business before the Legislative Committee. The committee is now adjourned.
All right. And I would like to reconvene this general session and move to agenda item 2L, interview and recommendation of members alternates to the school administrator position for the Committee of Credentials. The ad hoc committee recommends to the full commission the appointment of Jacob Guthrie to serve in the school administrator position on the Committee of Credentials. Jacob Guthrie was here. Is he still here? We were going to meet him, but we'll meet him next time. The committee also recommends that Richard Lopez and Tammy Patton be appointed as school administrator alternates. I move to approve the recommendations of the ad hoc committee. Thank you. Any further discussion? All those, yes?
Could I just make one
yes,
comment?
Please.
Just to express my appreciation for all of 6 candidates. This is my first time serving on this committee, but I was very impressed with the dedication and credentials of all of the people who put their names forward, and am looking forward to their continued interest in service, and so I wanted to express that appreciation.
Great, and I would like to express appreciation to the members of the ad hoc committee who interviewed and recommended these candidates. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Next is agenda item 2M, report of closed session. The Vice Chair will read the closed session report.
All right. Staff briefed the Commission on the case of Kathleen Carroll versus CTC and no reportable action was taken. The Commission denied the following petitions for reinstatement: Jeffrey Clark, Reginald Moore, Jack Poster, Mark Smith Jr. The Commission reviewed the transcripts in the matters of Jimmy Gonzalez, Andriana McCall, Hiawana Smith, and Michael Turner Jr. Decisions and orders will be prepared for the Commission's adoption. The Commission ordered a 30-day delay for preparation of the decisions and orders. The Commission rejected the proposed decision in the matter of Cesar Escobar and called for the transcript. The Commission adopted the following proposed decisions: Enrique Garcia, Jason Ham, Linda McDaniel. The Commission granted the following requests for reconsideration and sustained its previous decisions: Katrina Anjeja, Ruben Garcia, Paul Kovac, Thomas Sinagra. The Commission granted reconsideration in the matter of Diana Regalado and remanded the matter back to the Committee on Credentials. The Commission denied the request for reconsideration in the matter of Protis Taniform. The Commission discussed consent calendar item 27, Juan Centeno, and accepted the recommendation of the Committee on Credentials. The Commission discussed the following consent calendar items and remanded the matters back to the Committee of Credentials: Benjamin Gillum, Veronica Pellegrin, Dave Pinkston. Or Pinkton, I'm sorry.
All
or
right.
Pinkston, that was right.
Item 2N is new business. The bi-monthly agenda is presented for information. Are there any audience presentations? I have no notes to that effect, so everybody's just waiting to get to lunch. I now adjourn the February 2019 meeting of the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. The next meeting is April 11th and 12th, 2019. Thank you all.